In 2006, a young man named Dave Murphy had just achieved a lifelong goal. He had become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. Like any rookie, he was eager to get started, to put his training to use. His very first assignment was as a protective service officer. This role was all about providing physical security for a number of county-owned facilities. It wasn't exactly chasing down bad guys, but it was an important job, and for Dave, it was the first step in his new career. The first facility he was assigned to was the Capital City Theater. This wasn't just any building, it was a landmark in Salt Lake City. It had been standing since the early 1900s, a beautiful, grand, old theater with a rich history. And it was about to become a huge part of Dave's life, in ways he never could have imagined. So, in early August of that year, Dave reported to the Capital City Theater for his first day on the job. He was a little nervous, a little excited, ready to learn the ropes. The first person he met was his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. Dave walked in, ready to introduce himself and get to know the guy he'd be spending his nights with. But right away, Dave could tell that Morgan was strictly business. There was no friendly chatter, no welcome to the team. Morgan was all pro, a bit cold, and seemed focused on one thing, the job. The very first thing Morgan did was take Dave to the control room. This room was the nerve center of the theater's security, and it was located on the first floor. The theater itself was a big place, with 3 main floors and a full basement. Inside the control room, a bank of monitors flickered, displaying feeds from security cameras positioned all over the building. Morgan explained that the cameras were old, though. Their quality was poor. You could really only make out what was happening on screen if a light was on in that specific area. At night, when most of the lights were off, the screens were just fuzzy patches of black and gray. It wasn't an ideal system, but it was what they had. After the brief tour of the control room, Morgan turned to Dave. He said, "Now we're going to go do our rounds." He explained that this was a mandatory procedure. Every single shift, at the very beginning and at the very end, they had to do a full security sweep of the entire building. They had to check every door, make sure every light that was supposed to be off was off, and ensure the entire theater was secure before they could settle in for the night or head home. Morgan led the way, and their first stop was the basement. Dave followed him down a set of stairs, and the moment they stepped onto the basement level, Dave was taken aback. The place was huge. It wasn't just a small storage area, it was a massive, long hallway that stretched out into the dimness seemingly forever. The lighting down there was poor, just a few bare bulbs casting long, eerie shadows. Everything in the building was old, and you could really feel the age of the place in the basement. Right in the middle of this vast, empty hallway, there was a piano. It was just sitting there, a dark, silent shape that seemed completely out of place. Dave remembered thinking how incredibly creepy the whole scene was. This long, shadowy hallway with all these closed doors lining the walls, and this lone piano in the center of it all. An immediate, uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. He thought to himself that he really did not want to spend much time down here. But it was part of the job. So, he and Morgan walked the entire length of the hall. They checked every single door, making sure it was locked tight. They then made their way back up, systematically clearing the main floor, then the second floor, and finally the third floor. They checked every room, every closet, every corner. Everything was secure. After the round was complete, they returned to the control room. Dave was hoping that now, with the initial tour out of the way, he might get to know Morgan a bit. This was his partner, after all. They were going to be relying on each other for long hours in this empty building. But Morgan remained cold and distant. He barely spoke to Dave, offering only short, direct answers to any questions. It was clear he did not want to make small talk. And as their shift neared its end, Dave noticed that Morgan seemed almost desperate to get the final security round over with and just get out of the building. At the end of that first night, Dave drove home with a strange feeling. There was just something off about Morgan's behavior. It wasn't just that he was quiet, it was more than that. It felt like Morgan genuinely hated being in that theater. Dave had a gut feeling he was onto something. And it would turn out he was absolutely right. Morgan did not like being in that building, but it would take a little while before he was willing to tell Dave the reason why. For the next couple of days, Dave and Morgan did their security rounds together. Dave was still in training, so Morgan was showing him the exact procedure for securing every part of the massive building. Then, on August 9th, just 2 days after Dave's first shift, Morgan decided Dave was ready to handle it on his own. At the end of their shift, as it was time for the final sweep, Morgan told Dave to do the security round by himself. Dave felt confident. He'd done it a few times now and knew the layout. He started in the basement, just like they always did. He walked down that long, creepy hall, checking each door handle, making sure the lights were off. He finished the basement and went up to the first floor where the control room was. He checked all the rooms there, then moved into the main auditorium space. He walked through the rows of empty seats, checking all the little nooks and crannies to make sure no one was hiding out. From there, he went up to the second floor. He checked the rooms there, walked along the balcony overlooking the stage, and then made his way to the third and final floor. The third floor housed the offices for the theater's staff. At the very end of his search, the last room he needed to check was the rehearsal room. This room was a bit different from the others. It didn't have a door. It was just an open doorway. The procedure was simple: poke your head in, look around to make sure it was empty, and then move on. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room. He reaches in and flips the light switch on. The room floods with light. He scans it quickly. It's empty. Satisfied, he flips the light back off and turns to head back into the hallway to finish his shift. But just as he's turning, he hears an incredibly loud noise. A door right across the hallway from him slams shut with tremendous force. It was the bathroom door. His police instincts kicked in immediately. His first thought was that someone must have been hiding in the building. They had been in the bathroom, saw him coming, and made a run for it, slamming the door behind them as they tried to escape. He instinctively grabbed his radio. He called down to Morgan in the control room, his voice tense. "Someone's on the third floor," he said. Morgan immediately looked at the camera feed for the third floor hallway. But he didn't see anyone. The hallway was empty. Back on the third floor, Dave had already drawn his weapon. He was looking up and down the long hall, but he saw nothing. As he stood there, waiting for Morgan to come up and provide backup so they could search for this person, two things suddenly clicked in his mind. First, just because he heard the door slam didn't mean the person had run out. They could still be inside the bathroom. Maybe they slammed it from the inside to hide. He thought to himself, that's why Morgan can't see them on the camera. They're still in there. The second thing he realized sent a chill down his spine. That bathroom door, it couldn't slam. It was a heavy door fitted with a big, powerful hydraulic hinge, the kind that makes a door close slowly and silently. It was physically impossible for it to slam shut with that kind of force. His gun was now aimed directly at the bathroom door. A moment later, Morgan came up the stairs and appeared at his side. He saw the situation and drew his own pistol, aiming it at the door as well. They wordlessly agreed on a plan. On a count, they made entry, bursting into the bathroom, ready for a confrontation. They cleared every stall, every corner. But there was no one there. And there was no other way out. No windows, no vents big enough for a person. It was a dead end. Morgan and Dave were baffled. They figured the person must have run out after all and was now hiding somewhere else in the theater. They decided they weren't going to worry about how the door managed to slam. They just knew they had an intruder to find. So, with their guns still drawn, they left the bathroom and began a systematic search of the third floor. They checked every office, every closet. Every single door was still locked, just as Dave had left them. As they started making their way down the stairs to the second floor, Dave noticed something through the window in the stairwell door. The lights on the second floor were on. He remembered distinctly turning them all off just a few minutes ago. As they were walking down the stairs, he asked Morgan, "Hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor?" Morgan said no, he hadn't touched a thing. Their intruder, they thought, must be on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They pushed through the door, ready for anything. And they found that not only were all the lights on, but every single door on the second floor had been opened. Doors that Dave had personally checked and closed just minutes before were now standing wide open. They searched the entire second floor, room by room. They found nothing. No one was there. They methodically went through, turning off all the lights again and shutting and locking all the doors. They went down to the first floor. Everything there was exactly as it should be, lights off, doors locked. Then they descended back into the creepy basement. The tension was high now. They had searched almost the entire building and were expecting to finally come face to face with whoever was playing these games with them. But they found no one in the basement either. The entire theater was empty. Confused and on edge, they went back to the control room. They decided to review the security footage from the third floor, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone running down the hall when the door slammed. But the camera angle wasn't great. It was pointed down the hall, but you couldn't see the bathroom door itself. And of course, the hallway was dark, and the old cameras were useless without light. All they could see on the footage was the light from the rehearsal room turning on as Dave did his check. Then, a few seconds later, the light turned off. The screen went nearly black. And then, through the audio feed, they heard it. A massive, echoing slam. But they couldn't see what caused it. They had no explanation. They were both on edge, convinced someone could still be hiding somewhere. They did another full sweep of the entire building, just to be sure. Again, they found nothing. In the end, they had no choice but to chalk it up to something strange and unexplainable. Maybe they were just hearing things, seeing things. They decided to just get out of there and go home. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan was working a shift alone. Dave had the night off. Morgan was sitting in the control room monitoring the quiet building when he thought he heard something. It sounded like whispering coming from the hallway just behind him. After the experience with the slamming door a few nights earlier, he was already on high alert. He didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol and stood up. He stepped out into the hallway, and as soon as he did, the whispering sound seemed to move, getting farther and farther away from him down the hall. He looked around, but the hall was empty. He cautiously made his way down the hallway towards the main stairwell that led either up to the second floor or down into the basement. When he got to the top of the stairs, guns still raised, he listened. And that's when he heard a new sound. It was the distinct sound of someone coughing, and it was coming from the basement. At this point, Morgan would later admit that he was genuinely scared. Imagine being all alone in this massive old theater. Just a few days ago, you had a bizarre experience with slamming doors and mysterious open rooms, something another police officer witnessed with you. Now, you're by yourself, hearing voices and coughing coming from the creepiest part of the building. It was terrifying. He very slowly started to make his way down the stairs, his heart pounding. He was getting ready to clear the corner and confront whoever was down there. But just as he reached the bottom of the stairwell, the coughing stopped. He flipped on the lights for the basement hall. He looked down the long, empty corridor. There was nothing there. He started making his way down the hall, checking every door, just like he and Dave always did. He got all the way to the far end of the basement, and as he was finishing his check, he suddenly smelled smoke. A strong, distinct smell of something burning. It was coming from a door right next to him. Thinking there was a fire, he quickly unlocked the door and went inside. But the room was empty. There was no fire. He turned the light on, looked everywhere, but there was nothing burning. The smell of smoke, however, was overwhelming. He was now convinced that there had to be a fire somewhere in the basement. He started going into every single room, one by one, searching for the source. But he found nothing. And then, as mysteriously as it had started, the smell of smoke just dissipated. It was gone. He did a full check of the entire theater, every floor, every room, looking for any sign of a fire. There was nothing. He thought about calling the fire department, but what would he tell them? That he smelled smoke for a few minutes, but now there's no fire? He checked the building 3 or 4 more times just to be absolutely sure. Confident there was no fire, he just had to accept that he couldn't explain it. He was smelling things that weren't there. A few weeks went by. On September 4th, Dave arrived for his shift a little early. It started at 5 p.m., but he got to the theater around 4:30. As he walked in, he saw 3 staff members sitting at the front desk just chatting. As he walked past, he overheard one of them talking about ghosts inside the theater. This immediately got his attention. He walked over to the man who was talking and introduced himself. The man's name was Blair Fuller, and he was a senior accountant for the theater. Dave told him that he handled security for the building and that he had experienced some strange things himself. He asked Blair if he would be willing to share what he knew. Blair agreed, and they headed up to his office on the 3rd floor. They sat down, and Blair said, "Okay, I've got a doozy for you." He told Dave that a couple of years ago he had been working late in this very office. It was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. As he was working, he heard the building's elevator kick on. The elevator was right outside his office, and it was an old, loud machine. It was really obvious whenever it was moving. He didn't think much of it at first. But then it clicked. He was the only person in the entire building. He looked out through the glass window of his office door. He could see the little lights above the elevator door that showed which floor it was on. The lights were lit up, and they were moving. The elevator was coming up from the basement. It passed the 1st floor, then the 2nd. Finally, it arrived at the 3rd floor. The doors slid open. There was no one inside. Blair said that at this point, he still wasn't too concerned. He figured maybe it was some kind of scheduled maintenance or an automatic cycle it ran at night. But after a little while, a loud alarm started going off in the elevator. It was the alarm that sounds when something is blocking the door, preventing it from closing. He looked out his office window again. He could hear the ringing sound, but he could clearly see that there was nothing obstructing the doorway. The doors were just stuck open. Curious, he left his office and walked over to the elevator. He stepped inside. He said that the moment he set foot in the elevator car, he felt a massive sudden drop in temperature. It was ice cold inside. As he was standing there, he turned around to look back towards his office. And then the elevator doors started to close. He said that for whatever reason, he didn't step out. He just decided to ride it out and see what happened. As soon as the doors closed, the button for the basement lit up, as if someone had pressed it. The elevator began its descent. He was just standing there thinking about how bizarre this all was. The elevator was malfunctioning with an alarm just a moment ago, and now, as soon as he got inside, it was working perfectly and taking him to the basement. The elevator reached the basement, and the doors opened. There was no one there. Blair said it took all of his courage, but he called out, "Hey, is anyone down here?" He was met with total silence. As soon as he realized no one was going to answer, he said he didn't want to make another sound. He was standing in the elevator in the middle of that long, dark basement hall with the piano sitting out in the middle of it. The lights in the hall were off, and the only light was spilling out from the elevator car. He poked his head out and looked one way. Nothing. He looked the other way. Nothing but the faint outline of the piano. At this point, he was completely spooked. He jumped back into the elevator and started frantically pressing the button for the 3rd floor. He was hitting the door close button over and over. The doors finally shut, and the elevator took him back up to his office. He rushed into his office, shut the door behind him, and sat down at his desk, his mind racing. He was trying to rationalize what had just happened. As he was sitting there, trying to calm down, he heard a new noise. It sounded like banging, coming from just outside his office in the foyer area near the elevator. He got up, went to his door, and cautiously opened it. He peeked his head out and looked to the side. There was a big heavy metal filing cabinet there, and all of its drawers were pulled wide open. He definitely had not done that. And as he watched, one by one, the heavy drawers began to slam shut on their own. Bang. 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 One after another until the entire cabinet was closed. He walked over to it, trying to disprove what he had just seen. He thought maybe there was a problem with the drawers, that they would just shut on their own. But he opened one, and it stayed open. He had to physically push it for it to close. Something, or someone, had just slammed them all shut. That was it for him. He packed up his things, left the theater, and swore he would never work another night shift there again. Later that night, Dave told Morgan the story that Blair had shared with him. He wasn't sure how Morgan would react, if he'd be dismissive. But, to his surprise, Morgan opened up. He told Dave that long before Dave had started working there, he had always had this uncomfortable feeling in the theater, like he was constantly being watched. And then he reminded Dave of their shared experience with the slamming bathroom door and the lights on the second floor. Then Morgan told him about his solo shift. He described hearing the voices in the hall, the coughing from the basement, and the inexplicable smell of smoke when there was no fire. They started going back and forth, sharing all the strange, unsettling things they had experienced in that building. They both felt deeply uncomfortable there, and they realized they needed to do something. Dave came up with an idea. He said he had a best friend he could invite over one night. They would tell him they were just giving him a special behind-the-scenes tour of the historic theater. They wouldn't tell him about any of the strange events. They would just walk him through and see if he noticed anything, if he reacted to anything. It would be a way to see if they were just imagining things, to get an outside perspective. Morgan thought it was a good idea. So Dave called his best friend, a guy named Greg. Greg would later say he was a bit surprised to get an invitation for a late-night tour of the theater, but he was curious. Since it was his best friend asking, he agreed to come down and check it out. The next day, Greg showed up at the theater where Dave and Morgan were on shift. They started the tour. They showed him the main auditorium, the stage, the dressing rooms. Then they made their way down to the basement. Morgan went first and flipped on the lights. And instantly, both he and Dave saw it. A little way down the hall, on the left, one of the doors was standing open. This was a huge red flag. No doors were ever left open. Dave and Morgan immediately pushed Greg behind them for safety, and they both drew their pistols, aiming them at the open doorway. Greg stayed back as Dave and Morgan slowly and cautiously advanced down the hall towards the open door. They got right up to the doorway, preparing to push the door open and clear the room. But before they could touch it, the door slammed shut right in front of their faces. Greg, Dave, and Morgan all just stared at it, completely shocked. And before they could even process that, the door handle started rattling violently, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get out. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. The hallway was silent again. Dave and Morgan looked at each other and nodded. They had to go in. Greg was terrified of being left alone in the hallway, so he decided to follow them. The three of them entered the room, Dave and Morgan with their guns raised. It was a small storage room. They flipped on the light. There was no one there. Suddenly, Greg gasped and pointed to a corner of the room. He said, "Someone sitting in the corner?" Dave and Morgan immediately swung their guns towards the corner, but there was nothing there. It was empty. Greg insisted. "I just saw someone sitting there," he said, his voice trembling. It looked like he had a hood on, like a sweatshirt. He was right there. Now, all three of them were completely freaked out. Dave and Morgan had brought Greg there hoping to disprove the strangeness, and instead, it had escalated. All three of them had seen a door slam shut, and Greg was now claiming to have seen a figure in the room. This scared them all badly. They quickly left the room, locked it, shut off the lights, and got out of the basement. Greg said he was done, and left immediately. Dave and Morgan were left standing there wondering what on earth they were supposed to do now. At this point, Dave and Morgan started reporting these strange occurrences. They didn't mention anything about ghosts or hauntings, of course. They framed it as a series of potential break-ins and security breaches. Eventually, the county agreed that something needed to be done and decided to install a brand new upgraded camera system inside the theater. These new cameras had infrared technology, which meant they could see much more clearly in the dark. The hope was that this new system would finally allow them to catch whoever was breaking in and causing all this trouble. The new cameras were installed on September 15th. That night, Morgan was working alone again. He was sitting in the control room, familiarizing himself with the new system, clicking through the different camera feeds, and testing out the new features. At some point, as he was looking at the monitor for the main auditorium, something caught his eye. It looked like someone might be sitting in one of the seats out in the middle of the empty theater. The camera was zoomed out so he couldn't get a clear look. And since it was his first time using these new cameras, he wasn't sure what was normal and what wasn't. He zoomed the camera in, trying to get a better look. He could now see it more clearly. It was a figure, and it seemed to be wearing a hood or some kind of shroud over its head. It was just sitting there, motionless. And then, it slowly started to turn its head from side to side. As it turned, he could see, clear as day, a set of eyes glowing in the infrared view. And before Morgan could even react, the figure just started to rise up into the air, floating straight up towards the ceiling until it completely disappeared from view. That was it for Morgan. He didn't investigate. He didn't go looking. He was done. He literally quit his job that day. That was his very last shift at the Capital City Theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan quit, Dave was now working alone at the theater. He was in the control room one night when suddenly he heard the sound of a piano playing. There was only one piano in the entire theater. The one in the basement. As a police officer, it was his job to protect the building. He knew he had to go down there and check it out. It could be an intruder. He left the control room, drew his weapon, and started walking towards the basement stairs. As he got closer, the piano music got louder and louder. He made his way down the steps, and just as he was about to round the corner into the main basement hallway, he heard a loud bang. It was the sound of the wooden guard that protects the piano keys slamming shut. And the music stopped. He turned the corner and looked down the long hallway. There was no one there. He flipped on the light. The hall was empty. At that moment, he knew he wasn't going to find anyone. He knew this was the same thing that had been causing all the mayhem in the theater for months. Dave had seen enough. He was done with this place. He went right back upstairs, locked himself in the control room, and stayed there until the end of his shift. The very next day, he went to his sergeant and said, "You can never put me back inside that theater or I will quit," and sure enough, he was transferred. For the next 2 months, the theater didn't have a full-time security officer. Different officers would come in for a few hours here and there, but no one was assigned there permanently. That is, until November 26th. The department found another officer, a veteran cop named Josh Thomas, who agreed to take the full-time post at the theater. On November 26th, Josh Thomas reported for his very first shift. Because there had been no permanent officer, there was no one there to show him the ropes. He was all alone in the theater. By pure coincidence, Dave happened to be on patrol in his car that night, and his route took him near the theater. At some point during the night, a call came over Dave's radio. It was Josh. He was calling for backup, saying someone had broken into the theater. Dave's heart sank. He knew it probably wasn't a break-in. He knew exactly what was going on in that building. He was the closest unit to the theater, and even though the last thing he ever wanted to do was go back there, he felt a sense of responsibility. He had to go and back Josh up. And if it was what he thought it was, he needed to be the one to explain to this new officer what he was getting himself into. When Dave arrived at the theater, he went to the back door they always used. He saw Josh standing just outside the building. Dave would later say that Josh's eyes were as wide as saucers. He looked absolutely terrified. Dave walked over to him and asked what was going on, if the intruder was still inside. Josh explained that he had been doing his security rounds when he heard what sounded like voices coming from the basement. He checked all the rooms, but everything was secure. Then, as he made his way up to the third floor, he saw that the elevator had turned on. It was coming up from the basement. The light was on, and he could hear it whirring. When the elevator doors opened on his floor, there was no one there. He stood there looking at the empty car, and then the door obstruction alarm started going off. That's when he called for backup. Dave looked at him and said, "Look, let's just go search the building." "We'll do it together." They went inside and cleared the entire theater floor by floor. Of course, they found no one. Before Dave left, they went into the main auditorium and stood on the stage, just talking. Dave's back was to the audience seats, and Josh was facing him. Suddenly, in the middle of a sentence, Josh just stopped talking. He froze, and he was staring at something just over Dave's shoulder. Dave asked, "What is it?" And Josh, his voice barely a whisper, said, "There's something behind you." Dave slowly turned around. And as soon as he did, he saw what Josh was looking at. Standing in the very back of the dark theater, in a corner, was a man. His hands were by his sides, and his back was to them. He seemed to be looking down, and he had a hood pulled over his head. Dave turned his whole body to face this figure. And right as he did, the figure whipped around and looked directly at them. It had deep, dark, sunken eyes. Its face looked as if it had been horribly burned. It was black and charred. It stared at them for a second, and then it turned and ran out of a door at the back of the theater. Josh was convinced they had just seen the intruder. Dave was fairly certain they had just seen the entity that haunted the theater. They searched the entire building again, but they never found the cloaked figure. That was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room. He told him everything. He told him about the slamming doors, the voices, the smoke. He told him Blair's story about the elevator and the filing cabinets. He told him why Morgan had quit and why he himself had quit. Josh was now up to speed. Great, he thought. I'm glad I work here now. This was the last time Dave would ever set foot in the Capital City Theater. But his curiosity got the better of him. He started doing some research into the history of the building, and what he found was chilling. It turned out that back in the 1940s, there had been a horrible fire in the theater. A man had been trapped in the basement when the fire erupted. He had died down there. Dave shared this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them, all police officers, all trained to look in strong logical explanations, came to believe the same thing. They believed that what they had been witnessing, what they had seen and heard, was the ghost of the man who died in that fire all those years ago. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. To start our story, we have to look at a 28-year-old man named Artyom Sidorkin. Now, Artyom lived in Russia in a city called Izhevsk, which is located in the Ural region. He was a pretty normal guy who loved his work. He was a botanist, which meant he spent a vast majority of his time studying plants, trees, flowers, and the local flora of the region. He was passionate about nature, and he lived a very quiet, simple, and predictable life. He spent his days working in greenhouses, researching plant genetics, and taking walks through the dense Russian forests. But in the spring of 2009, something began to go very wrong with Artyom's health. It started with a very subtle, dull ache in his chest. At first, he tried to ignore it. We all do this when we get a little sick. We tell ourselves that we just slept wrong, or maybe we pulled a muscle while lifting something heavy at work. But for Artyom, the pain did not go away. In fact, it started getting worse with every single breath he took. Over the course of a few weeks, the dull ache transformed into a sharp, burning, stabbing sensation deep inside his right lung. It felt as though someone was taking a hot needle and poking him from the inside every time his chest expanded. Along with the pain came a persistent, hacking cough. At first, it was just a dry, irritating tickle in his throat, but it quickly escalated into deep, chest-racking coughs that left him completely exhausted and gasping for air. One morning, while sitting at his kitchen table trying to drink some tea, a particularly violent coughing fit seized him. He grabbed a white paper towel, covered his mouth, and coughed heavily. When he pulled the paper towel away, his heart sank. The paper was covered in bright red, fresh blood. The sight of the blood sparked instant panic. He realized he could no longer pretend this was just a minor chest cold or a pulled muscle. He put on his coat, walked out of his apartment, and made his way to the emergency room of the local hospital. When he arrived, the medical staff took one look at him and knew he was in serious trouble. He was incredibly pale, sweating, and hunched over, clutching his chest in obvious agony. Because of his age, his severe chest pain, and the fact that he was coughing up blood, the doctors immediately jumped to a very dark conclusion. In a young, otherwise healthy man, these specific symptoms almost always pointed to a highly aggressive, advanced stage of cancer. They feared he had a massive, fast-growing tumor inside his thoracic cavity that was actively eroding his airways. The doctors immediately ordered a chest X-ray to see what was going on inside his lungs. A short time later, the radiologist placed the film on the light box and examined the images. Sure enough, there was a distinct, solid, shadowy mass measuring about 5 centimeters in length, sitting right in the middle of Artyom's right lung. The boundaries of the mass were irregular and jagged, which is a classic visual indicator of a malignant, cancerous tumor. The medical team sat Artyom down and broke the devastating news. They told him they were almost certain he was facing a life-threatening, aggressive form of lung cancer. However, before they could schedule a major invasive surgery to cut out a large portion of his lung, they needed to perform a biopsy. This procedure would involve navigating a scope into its lung, snipping off a small piece of the mysterious mass, and sending it to a pathology lab to determine exactly what kind of cancer they were dealing with. Artyom was absolutely terrified. He was only 28 years old, with his entire life ahead of him, and suddenly he was staring down a potential death sentence. He spent the next few days in a state of deep depression, contemplating his own mortality and wondering how much time he had left. On the day of the procedure, he was wheeled into the operating room and placed under general anesthesia. The surgeon made the necessary incisions and carefully navigated into the right lung. When the surgeon located the mass, he used his instruments to carefully excise a portion of the tissue. He pulled the specimen out of Artyom's body and placed it onto a sterile metal tray. But as the surgeon looked down at the tissue sitting on the tray, his brow furrowed. It did not look like any cancerous tumor he had ever seen in his career. The tissue was red and inflamed, but it was shaped almost like a small envelope, as if it was holding something inside of itself. There was also a strange, vibrant hint of green color peeking through the bloody tissue. The surgeon reached for his forceps and gently parted the surrounding tissue to see what was hidden inside. When he opened it up, he froze in absolute disbelief. He literally stopped breathing for a moment, unable to comprehend what his eyes were showing him. Tucked neatly inside the tissue of Artyom's right lung was a living, breathing, bright green Siberian fir tree. It was 5 centimeters long, perfectly formed, and looked incredibly healthy. It had vibrant needles and was actively thriving in the warm, moist environment. The medical team quickly put the pieces of the puzzle together. Because Artyom was a botanist, he spent a tremendous amount of time around various plants, soil, and seeds. At some point during his work or his walks in the forest, he had accidentally inhaled a tiny microscopic seed of a Siberian fir tree. Instead of going down his esophagus or being coughed back out, the tiny seed had traveled deep into his bronchial tubes and lodged itself inside his lung tissue. The human lung is warm, dark, and highly humid. It is, for all intents and purposes, a perfect natural greenhouse. The seed had germinated, taken root in the rich, blood-fed tissue of the lung, and began to grow. As the small tree expanded, its sharp pine needles began to prick and pierce the delicate blood vessels and capillaries surrounding it. Every time Artyom took a breath, his lung tissue would contract and press against the sharp needles, causing internal bleeding, severe stabbing pain, and the coughing up of blood. When Artyom woke up from the anesthesia, the doctors walked into his room. Instead of delivering a grim prognosis of terminal cancer, they showed him the tiny green tree they had removed from his chest. Artyom was utterly shocked. He told them he had never felt like he had a forest growing inside of him, but his overwhelming feeling was one of pure ecstatic relief. He was completely cancer-free, and after the successful removal of the tiny fir tree, he made a full recovery and went back to his quiet life as a botanist. Now, our next story is even more unbelievable, but instead of a physical medical mystery, it is a psychological maze that took decades to fully unravel. It begins with a woman named Pauline Dakin. Growing up in Vancouver, Canada in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Pauline always had this nagging, unsettling feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with her family. Her parents, Ruth and Warren, had an incredibly tumultuous marriage. Warren was a heavy drinker, and when he was under the influence, he became extremely violent, volatile, and prone to terrifying outbursts. The household was always thick with tension, and Pauline and her brother lived in constant fear of their father's temper. So, in 1970, when Pauline was only 5 years old, her mother Ruth decided she could no longer live this way. She packed up their belongings, took the children, and separated from Warren. They moved into a new house on the opposite side of Vancouver. Pauline believed that this would be the start of a peaceful, normal life where they no longer had to walk on eggshells. But instead of the tension dissipating, Pauline noticed that her mother's behavior began to change in a highly concerning way. Even though Warren was no longer in the picture, Ruth became intensely anxious, paranoid, and hypervigilant. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, checking the locks on the doors and windows multiple times a day, and whispering as if someone might be listening to their conversation. Then, in 1974, when Pauline was 9 years old, her mother came home one afternoon and made a sudden announcement. She told Pauline and her brother that they were going on a fun family vacation. She instructed them to pack up their favorite clothes and toys, and they loaded everything into the family van. They embarked on a massive, grueling drive across the country, traveling over 1,000 miles away from Vancouver to the city of Winnipeg. But when they finally arrived in Winnipeg, they didn't pull up to a hotel. Instead, they stopped at a modest house. Ruth led the children inside, sat them down, and broke the news. She told them they were never going back to Vancouver. Winnipeg was their new permanent home. Pauline and her brother were completely devastated and deeply confused. They asked why they had to leave their old life behind, and they pleaded to see their father, whom they still loved despite his violent outbursts. But Ruth simply looked at them with tears in her eyes and told them that this was the way it had to be, and that when they were old enough, she would explain everything to them. With no other choice, Pauline tried to adapt to her new reality in Winnipeg. Over the next 4 years, she had absolutely no contact with her father, and she began to slowly put down roots. She made close friends, settled into her new school, and was finally starting to feel like a normal, stable teenager. But just as she began to feel comfortable, her mother sat them down once more. Ruth looked utterly terrified, worse than ever before. She told them they had to pack their bags immediately and leave Winnipeg. This time, they were moving all the way to New Brunswick on the far eastern side of Canada, thousands of miles away. Ruth made Pauline and her brother swear a solemn oath of absolute secrecy. They were strictly forbidden from telling a single soul that they were leaving. But on the day of the move, Pauline was spending some final moments with her best friend, Wendy. The emotional weight of disappearing without saying goodbye was too much for her to bear, and she let it slip to Wendy that she was moving away. When Ruth arrived at Wendy's house to pick Pauline up, the two young girls had to put on a desperate act. They forced themselves to exchange a very breezy, casual, and superficial goodbye, pretending they would see each other at school the next day, just so Ruth wouldn't suspect that Pauline had broken her promise of secrecy. They got into the car and drove away, leaving another life in ruins behind them. Once in New Brunswick, the family finally managed to put down roots and stayed there for several years. But the atmosphere of deep paranoia never truly left their home. Ruth remained incredibly anxious, constantly watching the street from behind the living room curtains and behaving as though some invisible, terrifying threat was always looming just outside their door. The children grew up in this shadow, never knowing what their mother was so desperately afraid of. Fast forward to 1988. Pauline is now 23 years old. She has carved out an independent life for herself, living about 2 hours away from her mother's home in New Brunswick. She is sharing an apartment with her boyfriend and working as a professional reporter for a local newspaper. She feels like she has finally escaped the bizarre anxiety of her childhood. One afternoon, her phone rings. It is her mother, Ruth. Ruth's voice is trembling, and she tells Pauline that she is staying at a local motel nearby and wants to meet with her immediately. She says, "I am finally ready to tell you the truth. I am ready to explain everything about your childhood and why we had to run." Pauline was incredibly intrigued and excited. This was a conversation that had been decades in the making. She hopped into her car and drove straight to the motel. When she arrived, she saw her mother pacing back and forth outside the room, looking extremely nervous and scanning the parking lot with intense suspicion. Pauline waved and walked up to her, about to speak, but Ruth quickly placed her finger over her lips, signaling her to be completely quiet. Without saying a single word, Ruth grabbed Pauline's hand and shoved a paper envelope into it. Written on the front of the envelope was a strict note: "Do not speak. Take off all of your jewelry, your watch, and anything made of metal and put it inside this envelope. It is highly likely that your jewelry is bugged with listening devices. I will explain everything once we are inside, but please do not say a single word." Pauline was utterly bewildered, but she did exactly as she was told. She took off her rings, her necklace, and her watch, slipped them into the envelope, and handed it back to her mother. In complete silence, they walked into the motel room. When they entered, Pauline saw a man sitting in the center of the room. She recognized him immediately. It was Stan Sears, the former reverend of the church they had attended back in Vancouver when she was a little girl. Ruth had worked as Stan's secretary for years, and Pauline knew they had always remained close friends who kept in touch. In fact, Pauline remembered seeing Stan show up unexpectedly in Winnipeg and New Brunswick over the years to visit her mother. But as they sat down, Ruth made a confession that shocked Pauline. She explained that she and Stan were actually deeply in love and had been carrying on a secret romantic relationship since their time in Vancouver. However, that revelation was nothing compared to what Ruth said next. She explained that the real reason they had been running and hiding for all these decades was because Pauline's father, Warren, was not just a violent alcoholic. He was actually a high-profile, powerful member of a massive organized crime syndicate in Vancouver, the Mafia. Ruth claimed that right after she separated from Warren, she discovered that the mob had put a contract out on her life. They believed that because she had left Warren, he could no longer control her, and they feared she knew too many of their dark secrets. They wanted her dead to ensure her silence. Stan also found out that he was a target. The mob discovered his secret relationship with Ruth, which made him a liability. Additionally, Stan had been counseling a man in his congregation who turned out to be a mobster wanting to leave the syndicate. When that man was suddenly assassinated, Stan realized that the mob knew he had been given highly sensitive information, making him an active target. Ruth and Stan decided they could not go to the police. They believed the mob had local law enforcement in their pocket, and they knew that families who turned to the police were brutally executed as an example. So, they chose to run and go into hiding together. When Ruth moved Pauline and her brother to Winnipeg and then to New Brunswick, Stan had actually moved along with them in tandem, staying close by to help protect them. Pauline sat there, completely stunned, trying to process this wild information. But as she thought about it, she realized this story actually explained so many of the bizarre, unexplained events from her childhood. She remembered coming home from school on multiple occasions to find her mother in a state of absolute panic, furiously pulling every single item of food out of the refrigerator and the pantry and throwing it all in the trash without any explanation. Now, Ruth explained that those were times they had received word that the mob had attempted to poison their food supply. Pauline also remembered being abruptly pulled out of school and enrolled in a different school across town on 6 different occasions. Ruth explained that those moves happened because they had received credible intelligence that the mob had discovered which school Pauline was attending, forcing them to scramble her location. By the end of the weekend, Pauline felt a strange mix of shock and relief. She finally had an answer to the chaos of her youth. But then her mother and Stan dropped another bombshell. They told her she was still in active danger, but they had taken steps to secure their safety. They explained that they had finally grown tired of living in constant hiding, so they had contacted a highly secret branch of the authorities. They had been placed into a special, classified witness protection program designed for families targeted by organized crime. They referred to the shadow program as entering the weird world. In this weird world, undercover agents would constantly follow them around, tracking their movements to ensure no hitmen could get close to them. Ruth told Pauline that because she and her brother were also targets, they had arranged for undercover agents to monitor them as well, even though they had been unaware of it. Stan reached into his bag and pulled out a heavy black radio. He handed it to Pauline and told her that this radio broadcasted directly to the agents assigned to watch her. He warned her that she must only use it in a life-or-death situation because the moment she called for help, federal agents would risk their lives and engage in a gunfight to save her. Pauline held the radio, her hands trembling. She looked at her mother and asked what had happened to her father, Warren. Was he in prison? Ruth shook her head and said no, he wasn't in jail. She explained that Warren had also been brought into the weird world, and she handed Pauline a handwritten letter. The letter was indeed from her father. It was addressed to Pauline, and in it he wrote about how he had been moved into this protective program and was looking forward to the day when Pauline would join them in the weird world. Completely overwhelmed, Pauline said goodbye to her mother and Stan and left the motel. She got into her car, but before she could start the engine, she saw Stan running out of the motel toward her, clutching a round object. He tapped on her window, and when she rolled it down, he handed her a magnetized round piece of metal. He told her it was a highly advanced GPS transponder. He instructed her to stick it out of sight underneath the frame of her car so that the undercover agents could constantly track her exact location and find her quickly if she was ever kidnapped by the mob. Pauline thanked him, placed the transponder under her car, and drove home. But living with this knowledge was incredibly agonizing. The paranoia began to consume her. Every car that drove behind her felt like a hitman. Every shadow in her apartment felt like an assassin. After just a few days of living in constant terror, Pauline couldn't take it anymore. She abruptly broke up with her boyfriend, quit her job at the newspaper, packed up her things, and moved into a new, isolated apartment. She called her mother and told her she wanted to join the weird world immediately. Her mother and Stan were delighted by her decision, but they told her that entering the program was a highly complex process. They said that many different high-level agents had to coordinate her transition, and they told her to be patient and wait for an agent to contact her. So, Pauline waited. She lived in isolation, checking her locks, clutching her radio, and waiting for the call. But days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. In fact, the waiting dragged on for 5 long years. During those 5 years, Pauline slowly began to rebuild a normal life. She met a kind man named Kevin, who eventually became her husband. As they spent long nights talking, Pauline decided to share her family's wild secret with him. But as Kevin listened to the details, he began to ask logical questions that Pauline had never considered. He asked why a secret government agency would keep her waiting for 5 years without any contact. He asked why they would use a civilian radio or a magnetic transponder instead of official government protocols. He suggested that something was deeply wrong with the story. Pauline wanted to believe her mother, but Kevin's questions sowed seeds of doubt. She realized she needed to know the truth once and for all. She decided to set up a clever sting operation to test her mother and Stan. She called her mother, crying and panting heavily, putting on an incredibly convincing performance. She told her that someone had just kicked in the door to her apartment, searched her things, and fled. She asked if she should call the local police. Ruth panicked and told her absolutely not to call the police. She said she would immediately get in touch with Stan so he could alert the undercover agents watching her building. Just a few minutes later, Ruth called back. She sounded incredibly relieved. She told Pauline that she had spoken to Stan, who had contacted the undercover agents stationed outside her apartment. Ruth said the agents had witnessed 2 mafia hitmen break into her apartment, but they had moved in quickly, tackled them, and taken both hitmen into custody. She assured Pauline that she was safe now. Pauline felt a cold, sinking feeling in her chest. She took a deep breath and said, "Mom, I made the whole thing up. Nobody broke into my apartment. I've been sitting here quietly all day. I lied to you." The line went dead silent. It was in that moment that the illusion shattered. Pauline realized that her entire life, since the age of 5, had been built on a massive, fabricated lie. There was no mafia, her father was not a hitman, and there were no undercover agents protecting them. It was all a fantasy. But as Pauline dug deeper, she discovered the incredibly complex psychological truth behind the lie. It turned out that Stan Sears was suffering from a rare mental health condition known as delusion syndrome. People with this condition can appear completely normal, highly intelligent, and perfectly lucid in their daily lives, but they harbor one single, fixed, unshakable delusion. In Stan's mind, he truly believed that the mafia was hunting him down. Because of his close relationship with Ruth, he had gradually passed this delusion on to her. This is a recognized, rare psychological phenomenon known as folie à deux, or madness for two. When a highly dominant, charismatic personality with a delusion is paired with a highly submissive, anxious partner, the partner can adopt the delusion as absolute reality. When Pauline later confronted both her mother and Stan, she expected them to break down and apologize for the decades of deception, but they didn't. They couldn't. To them, the danger was still absolute. They refused to believe Pauline's evidence, and they continued to live in fear. Their biggest worry after Pauline confronted them was not that their lie had been exposed, but rather that Pauline was putting herself in mortal danger by refusing to use her GPS transponder and radio. They genuinely believed she was going to be assassinated by the mob. Ruth and Stan eventually took this delusion to their graves, never once admitting it was a lie because their minds simply could not process reality. Pauline had to find a way to make peace with her bizarre childhood on her own. She did so by writing a best-selling memoir about her experiences titled Run, Hide, Repeat, which allowed her to finally close that chapter of her life. Our final story brings us to the quiet, scenic town of Del Mar, New York, in November of 2004. Del Mar was the kind of close-knit, peaceful suburb where people moved to raise their families. It was safe, the schools were excellent, and major crimes were virtually unheard of. This was the place that 52-year-old Peter Porco and his 54-year-old wife Joan called home. Peter and Joan were incredibly ordinary, hard-working, middle-class Americans. They lived in a beautiful, comfortable two-story house on a tree-lined street. They had been happily married for over 30 years and had built a wonderful life together. Peter was a highly respected appellate court clerk, known for his sharp mind, his gentle demeanor, and his absolute commitment to his job. Joan was a speech pathologist, a kind and patient woman who dedicated her life to helping children with speech impediments. The couple had 2 sons. Their oldest son, Jonathan, was 23 years old and was a proud naval officer stationed at a submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. Their younger son, Christopher, was 21 years old and was a student at the University of Rochester, located a few hours away. From the outside, the Porco family appeared to be the absolute model of success and happiness. But underneath that perfect exterior, a deeply disturbing dynamic was beginning to unfold. To understand the tragedy that took place, we have to look closely at the events of Monday, November 15, 2004. It began like any other chilly autumn morning. Peter Porco's alarm went off at his usual time, and he rose from his bed to start his well-rehearsed morning routine. Peter was a man of deep habit. He walked into the master bathroom, turned on the light, and relieved himself. He washed his hands, looked at his reflection in the mirror, and picked up his shaving cream. He lathered his face, took his razor, and carefully shaved his beard, rinsing the blade under the warm, running water, just as he had done thousands of times before. Once he was finished, he wiped his face dry with a clean towel and walked back into his bedroom to put on his neat, professional work clothes. With his clothes on, Peter quietly walked downstairs, taking care not to wake Joan, who was still asleep in their bed upstairs. The house was peaceful and quiet. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed the coffee pot, filled it with water, added fresh coffee grounds to the filter, and switched on the machine. As the rich scent of brewing coffee began to fill the kitchen, Peter decided to utilize those few quiet minutes to do some light housework. He went over to the dishwasher, which had finished its cleaning cycle the night before. He opened the door, pulled out the racks, and began systematically unloading the clean dishes. He placed the plates, bowls, and coffee mugs into their designated cabinets and neatly sorted the silverware into the drawer. Once the dishwasher was empty, he gathered the dirty cups and plates that had accumulated in the kitchen sink, loaded them inside, added detergent, and started a new cycle. By this time, his fresh pot of coffee was fully brewed. Peter poured himself a warm mug and decided he wanted to read the morning newspaper. The paper was usually delivered early and left on the driveway, so Peter walked over to the front door, turned the handle, and stepped outside into the crisp, cool autumn air. He walked down the front steps, picked up the tightly rolled newspaper from the driveway, and turned around to head back inside. But as he pushed against the front door, he realized it wouldn't budge. In his morning haze, he had forgotten that the lock was set to automatically engage when the door closed. He was locked out of his own house. However, this was not a major problem. Like many homeowners, Peter had prepared for this exact scenario. He walked over to the welcome mat lying on the front porch, lifted up one of the corners, and retrieved the spare key he kept hidden underneath. He slipped the key into the deadbolt, turned it, opened the door, and walked back into the warm house. He made sure to step back outside for a brief moment to place the spare key back in its hiding spot under the mat before heading back inside. He sat down at the kitchen table, took a sip of his hot coffee, and spent several minutes quietly reading the morning news. When he was finished, he stood up, carried his empty mug over to the sink, and placed it inside. He then opened the refrigerator, took out some sandwich ingredients, and packed himself a neat lunch inside his black lunchbox, preparing for his daily commute to the courthouse. Peter was a man of absolute punctuality. He hated being late, and his colleagues knew they could always count on him to be at his desk precisely on time. With his lunchbox in hand and his keys in his pocket, Peter walked over to the front door, ready to leave. But as he reached for the handle, his body suddenly went completely limp. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor right in front of the door and died. His body lay there, completely blocking the entryway. Back at the appellate court, the hours began to tick by. 9 o'clock came and went, and Peter's desk remained empty. His colleagues were immediately confused. This was completely unlike Peter. If he was going to be even a few minutes late, he would always call. They tried calling his home phone and his cell phone, but there was no answer. As the morning progressed, their concern turned to genuine worry. The court officials decided to dispatch a court officer to Peter's residence to perform a welfare check and make sure he was okay. When the officer pulled up to the beautiful two-story home in Delmar, he noticed that the family's cars were parked in the driveway. This made Peter's absence even more suspicious. The officer walked up the front steps and knocked loudly on the front door. He waited, but there was only silence. He knocked again, calling out Peter's name, but received no response. He reached out and tried the door handle. To his surprise, the lock was turned and the door was unlocked. He pushed the door open, but it only moved a few inches before hitting something heavy on the floor behind it. The officer leaned forward, peeking his head through the narrow gap, and gasped in horror. Lying on the floor in a massive pool of blood was Peter Porco. His head had been subjected to a devastating, violent attack, and he was clearly deceased. The officer immediately backed out of the house, pulled out his radio, and called for urgent backup and emergency medical services. Within minutes, the peaceful neighborhood was flooded with police cruisers, ambulances, and forensic units. Detectives carefully entered the home, navigating around Peter's body. They began a sweep of the house, moving up the stairs to search for other occupants. When they walked into the master bedroom, they were met with a scene of absolute carnage. Lying in the bed, covered in blood, was 54-year-old Joan Porco. Her face and head had been brutally shattered by a heavy, sharp object. The sheets and walls were stained with blood. But as the paramedics rushed to her side, they realized something truly miraculous. Despite the catastrophic nature of her injuries, Joan was still breathing and had a weak pulse. She was immediately stabilized, carried down the stairs on a stretcher, and rushed to the nearest hospital, where she underwent hours of emergency neurosurgery. Doctors were forced to place her into a medically induced coma to protect her highly damaged brain, and her survival remained highly uncertain. Back at the crime scene, forensic investigators began meticulously searching for clues. They discovered that the home's security alarm system panel, located near the entrance, had been violently smashed and ripped from the wall. Outside, the landline telephone wires had been cleanly cut with a pair of shears. A screen on one of the basement windows had been sliced open, suggesting that the killer had used that window to slip inside undetected. But as the detectives looked closer, they realized this was not a home invasion robbery gone wrong. Peter's wallet, filled with cash, was sitting right where he had left it. Joan's expensive jewelry was still untouched in her drawers. The killer had bypassed valuable electronics and personal belongings. This was a targeted, highly personal attack. During their search of the home, investigators found a heavy fireman's axe hidden inside one of the bedroom closets. The axe was covered in blood, hair, and bone fragments. It belonged to the Porco family, and testing quickly confirmed that it was indeed the weapon used to attack both Peter and Joan. The police immediately sought to contact the couple's two sons to deliver the tragic news. They reached Jonathan, who was out at sea on his Navy submarine, and he was deeply devastated. They also reached out to the University of Rochester to locate 21-year-old Christopher. When Christopher learned that his parents had been found, he placed a phone call to the police department to get more information. In the recorded phone call, Christopher's voice was shockingly flat and calm. He introduced himself, explained that he had been told his parents were found dead, and asked if the police had any details. The officer asked where he was, and Christopher calmly replied that he was at school in Rochester, New York. When the officer told him to drive straight to Albany Medical Center because his mother was still alive, Christopher simply asked what her condition was, stating he hadn't spoken to her yet. For anyone listening to that recording, the lack of emotion in Christopher's voice was deeply chilling. There was no panic, no tears, and no desperation. He sounded as though he was making a routine inquiry. And as detectives began to dig into Christopher's background, they quickly realized why. Christopher was a cold, calculating psychopath, and he was the one who had planned and executed the attack on his own parents. The investigators discovered that Christopher's life was a massive web of lies and financial fraud. He had been failing out of the University of Rochester due to poor attendance and bad grades. To hide his failures from his parents and maintain a lavish lifestyle, he had been forging his father's signature on major financial documents. He had taken out over $31,000 in student loans and lines of credit in Peter's name, using the money to pay his tuition and purchase a bright yellow Jeep Wrangler. When his parents began receiving notices about these mysterious loans, they realized what their son had done. Just days before the attack, Peter had confronted Christopher in a series of tense, emotional emails. Peter told him that his behavior was a betrayal of trust and that he could no longer support him financially if he continued to lie. But Peter also wrote that he loved him, and he begged Christopher to come home so they could figure out a way to resolve the debt together. Instead of facing his parents and taking responsibility, Christopher decided to eliminate them. On the night of Sunday, November 14th, Christopher snuck out of his college dorm in Rochester. He got into his yellow Jeep and drove more than 200 miles east to his parents' home in Delmar. He arrived in the middle of the night, cut the telephone lines from the outside, and slipped through the basement window. He walked over to the alarm panel and smashed it to silence any alert. He then grabbed his father's fireman's axe, walked quietly up the stairs to the master bedroom, and brutally attacked his sleeping parents, striking them repeatedly in the face and head with the heavy weapon. Believing he had killed them both, Christopher hid the bloody axe in a closet, got back into his yellow Jeep, and drove all the way back to Rochester, arriving at his dorm room in the early morning hours to establish an alibi. But while the crime itself was horrific, it was the medical mystery surrounding Peter Porco's final hours that left investigators and medical experts completely stunned. It is one of the most bizarre and haunting phenomena in forensic history. Peter had been struck 16 times in the head with a heavy axe. His skull was fractured in multiple places, and his brain had suffered catastrophic fatal trauma. But because of the specific way the axe had damaged his brain, the pathways that processed pain and conscious awareness had been completely destroyed, while the deeper, primitive structures of his brain remained intact. In his final moments, Peter's conscious mind was completely offline. He did not realize he had been attacked, and he could not feel the physical trauma. Instead, his brain reverted entirely to procedural memory, the deep-seated habits and routines that he had performed every single day for decades. And so, acting entirely on autopilot, Peter Porco simply got out of bed, walked into the bathroom, shaved his face, got dressed in his work clothes, walked downstairs, made coffee, unloaded the dishwasher, got locked out, retrieved the hidden key, read the newspaper, packed his lunch, and only collapsed and died when his body finally ran out of blood at the front door. The image of a man quietly going about his peaceful, ordinary morning chores while suffering from 16 fatal axe wounds to the head is almost impossible to comprehend. It highlights the incredible, terrifying power of human habit and the complexity of the brain. The trial of Christopher Porco began in 2006 and quickly became a national media sensation. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against Christopher, including security camera footage of his yellow Jeep traveling on the New York State Thruway at the exact times of the crime, DNA evidence, and testimony from his college classmate. But the most shocking aspect of the trial was the behavior of his surviving mother, Joan. Joan had survived the horrific attack, though she lost an eye, a portion of her skull, and was left with severe facial scarring. When she first woke up from her medically induced coma, she had indicated to the detectives, through nods and gestures, that Christopher was the person who had attacked them. However, as the trial approached, Joan suffered from profound memory loss regarding the night of the attack. She completely recanted her initial identification of her son and refused to believe that Christopher could commit such a heinous act. She stood by him unconditionally, raising $250,000 to post his bail and allowing him to live with her in the very house where the murder occurred. Every single day of the trial, Joan walked into the courthouse hand in hand with Christopher, presenting a united front to the jury. She pleaded with the public and the court to find the real killer, insisting that her son was completely innocent. Despite her emotional support, the jury was not convinced. The mountain of physical and circumstantial evidence against Christopher was too great to ignore. After several days of deliberation, the jury found Christopher Porco guilty of second-degree murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison, ensuring he would spend the majority of his remaining years behind bars. Even after the guilty verdict, Joan Porco refused to abandon her son. She continues to visit him in prison and speaks to him on the phone regularly. It remains one of the most tragic, heart-wrenching, and deeply unsettling stories of maternal devotion in true crime history, leaving a lingering, haunting question about the lengths a mother will go to protect her child, even when that child has committed the ultimate betrayal. Now, let us examine the sheer length and depth of these cases and the profound psychological impacts they had on the surviving family members. When we look back at the case of Pauline Dakin, we see a woman who spent almost her entire life running from shadows that did not exist. The damage inflicted by Stan Sears's deep-seated psychiatric delusion was not physical, but it was incredibly destructive nonetheless. For decades, Pauline was forced to look at her loving father as a monster, an assassin, and a key figure in a violent mafia syndicate. She was denied a relationship with him, and she spent her formative years in a state of hypervigilance, expecting a bullet or poison to end her family's lives at any moment. Her childhood was defined by packing boxes, midnight flights, and forced goodbyes to dear friends. And yet, when the truth was finally revealed, there was no sense of closure or relief. The tragedy of delusion syndrome and folie à deux is that the people trapped inside the illusion cannot simply be reasoned out of it. To Ruth and Stan, the threat was as real as the air they breathed. Confronting them with facts did not shatter the illusion. Instead, it only isolated Pauline further. She was left with a choice: to live in their fabricated paranoid world, or to step out into reality and be viewed by her own mother as a doomed, targets of opportunity casualty who had abandoned her protection. The emotional toll of that isolation is difficult to overstate. Pauline had to mourn the loss of a mother who was still physically alive, knowing that her mother was living in a constant state of terror on her behalf. By writing her book, Pauline was able to take back control of her narrative and share her story with the world, but the scars of her bizarre, shadow-filled childhood would remain with her forever. Similarly, when we look at the Porco case, we are forced to confront the dark depths of human psychology and the absolute limits of maternal love. The tragedy of Peter and Joan Porco is one that shakes us to our core because it took place within the safest sanctuary imaginable, a loving, supportive family home in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. Peter Porco was a father who, even when faced with his son's massive financial betrayal, responded with a letter of disappointment mixed with profound love and an offer of help. He did not throw his son out or turn him in to the police. He begged him to come home so they could solve the problem together as a family. And in return for that love and grace, Christopher responded with the ultimate act of violence. He did not just kill his father, he attempted to erase his entire family, cutting the phone lines and smashing the security system to ensure no help would arrive as he swung a heavy fireman's axe into his sleeping parents' faces. The physical reality of Peter Porco's final moments is something that will forever haunt the minds of those who investigate this case. The human body is a highly complex machine, and when subjected to such extreme trauma, the brain's ability to compartmentalize and rely on procedural memory is both a miracle and a horror. Peter's subconscious mind, working to protect him from the sheer agonizing reality of his injuries, allowed him to spend his final hour of life in peaceful, mundane routine. He did his chores, made his coffee, and checked his mail, totally unaware that his life was slipping away with every step he took. It is an image of profound, tragic peace in the midst of absolute horror. And yet, the tragedy did not end with Peter's death. It continued in the courtroom, where Joan Porco, scarred, disfigured, and permanently damaged by her son's hand, chose to stand by him anyway. The psychological defense mechanisms required for a mother to look at her child, knowing he is accused of hacking her husband to death and trying to do the same to her, and still hold his hand, are mind-boggling. Whether Joan truly lost her memory of that horrific night, or if her mind simply locked the memory away in a dark, inaccessible vault to protect her from a reality too painful to bear, we will never know. But her continued devotion to Christopher, her regular visits to the maximum security prison, and her refusal to acknowledge his guilt serve as a chilling reminder of the complexity of family bonds. These stories, though vastly different in their details, all share a common thread. They show us how the human mind, when faced with extreme stress, trauma, or psychological disease, can create its own version of reality. Whether it is a tiny fir tree growing in a lung, an elaborate mafia conspiracy born of a shared delusion, or a dying father performing his morning chores on autopilot, the truth is indeed far stranger and often far more tragic than any fiction we could ever write. We are left to ponder the fragility of our own perceptions of reality. We wake up every day assuming that the world around us is exactly as we see it. We trust our senses, our memories, and our loved ones. But as these cases demonstrate, the line between what is real and what we believe to be real can sometimes be incredibly thin, and when that line is crossed, the consequences can be absolutely devastating. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the early 1990s, a young woman in her 20s named Krista Froder was managing a retail store called the Boston Store in Madison, Wisconsin. She was dedicated and professional, and she had a real knack for the job. Not long after she started there, the store hired another employee. His name was Bart Halderson. Like Krista, he was in his early 20s, though he was about 3 years younger than her. He was brought on as a clerk. Now, Bart and Krista didn't know each other before they started working together, but their shifts often lined up, and as time went on, they naturally started talking and getting to know one another. It didn't take long for them to realize they had a surprising amount in common. They had both grown up in the general area just outside of Madison. They had even graduated from the same college, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And they discovered a shared passion for home design. Krista, who had majored in art history, was particularly passionate about the interior side of things, how a space could feel, the colors, the furniture, the whole atmosphere. Bart, on the other hand, was just one of those people who seemed to be born with a natural talent for fixing things. With just his bare hands and a few tools, he could figure out almost any problem. Growing up, his favorite projects were always related to home repairs. It didn't matter if it was something small and simple or a huge, complex undertaking. He just found this deep sense of satisfaction in keeping a home in perfect working condition. And so, surrounded by the daily routines of retail, Bart and Krista bonded over these shared interests and their similar background. Their casual work friendship slowly blossomed into something more, a genuine romance. By 1994, they had both moved on from the Boston store. They had gotten married and moved into their first apartment together in DeForest, Wisconsin, which wasn't too far from Madison. Life was starting for them, and everything felt full of promise. 2 years later, in 1996, Bart and Krista welcomed their first child, a little boy they named Mitchell. The moment Mitchell was born, Krista knew she wanted to stay home with him, to be there for every little moment. Bart was completely supportive of her decision. He went out and secured a great job as an accountant, a position that paid well enough to support their growing family. Just 18 months after Mitchell arrived, they welcomed their second and final child, another boy whom they named Chandler. Their family felt complete. A few years after Chandler was born, Bart and Krista had diligently saved up enough money to finally buy a house of their own. The house they chose was a modest, small, 2-story home in a very quiet, peaceful little town in Wisconsin called Windsor. Windsor was close to DeForest where they had been renting, but this little house was different. It was theirs. It was perfect for Bart, Krista, and their 2 young boys. It wasn't just about having enough space for the family to grow. Because it was their own home, Krista could finally unleash her passion for interior design. She carefully planned the layout of every room, and she took immense pride in keeping the house perfectly tidy and beautiful at all times. For Bart, this house was a canvas. He immediately dove into one home repair project after another. This house became his trophy, a symbol of everything he had worked for, and he was determined to keep that trophy polished and pristine. But it wasn't just the physical house that made it feel like their forever home. It was the community. As soon as they moved in, Bart and Krista made friends with all of their neighbors. The people on their street were incredibly friendly and welcoming. Before long, the Haldersons were deeply involved in community activities. They volunteered with the Boy Scouts and the Kiwanis Club. They donated their time and money to other local charities. It was clear, very quickly, that the Halderson family had found the place where they truly belonged. And so, for the next 2 decades, life for the Haldersons in that little home in Windsor was, by all accounts, perfect. Bart continued to climb the ladder at his accounting firm, providing a stable and comfortable life for his family. Krista remained a devoted mother and a meticulous housekeeper, creating a warm and loving home. As for their sons, Mitchell and Chandler, they were given every opportunity their parents could possibly afford them. They grew up in a loving, supportive environment, and both of them seemed to thrive. By 2021, the picture of the Halderson family was one of complete success. The older brother, Mitchell, who was now 25, had moved out and was living on his own in an apartment. He had graduated from college and landed an incredible IT job with a very successful local company. He was engaged to be married and was on the verge of buying his own house. He was following right in his parents' footsteps, building a solid and happy life for himself. As for the younger brother, Chandler, who was 23 at the time, he was still living at home with Bart and Krista, but he seemed to be doing just as well as his older brother. He was in his final year of college, on the cusp of graduation. He had already accepted a full-time, high-prestige job with SpaceX, which was set to start in Florida as soon as he had his degree. While finishing up his last year of school, he told his parents he was working part-time at a local insurance company to help pay them rent. He also said he was volunteering his remaining spare time with the Madison Police Department on their elite rescue scuba diving team. Chandler was also in a committed relationship with his girlfriend. Everything seemed to be going perfectly for Bart, Krista, Mitchell, and Chandler. But their lives were about to take a sudden and devastating turn for the worst. It all began in June of 2021. That month, Chandler, who was supposedly just weeks away from flying out to Titusville, Florida, to begin his dream job with SpaceX, had a terrible accident. He said he fell down an entire flight of stairs, smashing his head in the process. He told his family he immediately picked himself up and tried to convince himself that he was okay, just a bit shaken. But over the course of that day, he started to feel woozy and disoriented. He said his legs started to feel numb, and in a panic, he rushed himself to the hospital. Unfortunately, when doctors scanned his brain and checked him over, they supposedly discovered he had a severe concussion from the fall. They told him he had a brain bleed that would almost certainly require surgery at some point in the future. And the numbness in his legs, they said, appeared to be the result of permanent nerve damage. And so, just like that, Chandler, who had been so excited about this incredible opportunity in Florida, was suddenly back home, confined to the house, wearing a neck brace and using a cane to get around. Even with the cane, he could barely walk. To make matters even worse, he almost immediately lost the job at SpaceX. He told his family that because he couldn't travel to Florida to start on time, they had to fill the position with someone else. Chandler did his best to stay positive and optimistic in front of his family, but this was a crushing blow. Everything he had seemingly worked so hard for had just been snatched away. It was crushing for his family, too. Seeing their beloved Chaz, as they called him, lying on the couch all day, looking totally miserable and depressed, was awful. But as terrible as Chandler's accident was, the trauma it inflicted on him and his family was nothing compared to what was about to happen next. The Haldersons owned a small cabin in a part of Wisconsin called White Lake. It was located about a 3-hour drive north of their home in Windsor. The cabin was nestled inside a rural forested area right near a large lake, also called White Lake. This cabin had been in the Halderson family since the 1940s. When Mitchell and Chandler were little kids, Bart and Krista would take them up there all the time. They'd go fishing, swimming, or just relax by the water. It was their family vacation spot. But at some point, as the boys got older, they weren't as interested in going to the cabin anymore. As a result, Bart and Krista basically stopped going up there. However, just 2 weeks after Chandler's horrific injury, a huge storm rolled through the White Lake area. After the storm passed, Bart and Krista received a phone call. Some people who lived permanently in White Lake called them and said, "Hey, I was driving past your cabin and I saw there were some broken windows. It looks like your cabin might have been damaged by the storm." And so, Bart and Krista started to worry. They thought, "Oh my goodness, we have to get up there as soon as we can to patch up that window and check for any other damage before another storm rolls through and completely ruins the place." So, Bart and Krista pulled out their calendar. They saw that the next weekend was the 4th of July weekend. The 4th of July is a very big holiday in America, a celebration of independence. In White Lake, they celebrate it with a big parade down Main Street and a spectacular fireworks display out over the lake. Bart and Krista figured, you know what, let's just hold off for a couple of days and time our trip with the holiday weekend. We can make the necessary repairs and also enjoy the festivities, turn it into a little mini vacation. And so, that was the plan. But right before they were supposed to leave for this trip up to White Lake, Bart and Krista started acting a little strange. On the evening of Thursday, July 1st, the day before they were scheduled to leave, they began packing their things. Since Chandler was living with them and couldn't go anywhere due to his injury, he was at home and saw them getting ready. At one point, he got up and hobbled over, trying to help them pack, but it was short-lived because his legs were just too weak. So he sat back down and just watched them. And what he saw was odd. They were packing lots and lots of cash and several silver bars into their luggage. Chandler thought this was strange, but he decided not to say anything. He figured, you know what, maybe they want to stash their valuables in the cabin for safekeeping. It's their business, not mine. So Bart and Krista continued to pack, and Chandler continued to watch. At some point, he asked his parents, "So how are you getting up to White Lake?" His parents just said, "Oh, we're getting a ride from our friends, another couple. They're driving us up." But they didn't tell him who the couple was. They were vague, just saying, "our friends." Again, Chandler is sitting there thinking, okay, this whole thing is a little bit weird, but he told himself, it's their business. I'm not going to press them about it. They obviously don't want to tell me. So he just let it go. At some point, Bart and Krista finished packing. They moved all their luggage to the front of the house, right near the front door. A little while later, they and Chandler all went to their separate rooms and went to sleep. The next morning, Friday, July 2nd, Chandler got up early, around 6 in the morning. When he woke up, he began slowly hobbling his way down the stairs. He expected to see his mom and dad in the kitchen, having breakfast and getting ready to leave. They certainly wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. But when he got downstairs, the house was dark and completely empty. All of the bags that his parents had packed the night before and placed by the front door were gone. Chandler thought, did my parents get up at 5 in the morning and leave without telling me? He went to the front door and looked out the window, thinking maybe they were just waiting outside. But when he looked out, his parents weren't there. And sure enough, both of their cars were still parked in the driveway. So Chandler was left to conclude that, well, I guess my parents did get picked up by whoever these mystery friends were, and they just didn't feel the need to wake me up and tell me they were leaving. This did leave Chandler feeling a little shaken. He kept thinking about the strangeness of what they were packing, the fact that he didn't know who they were with, and now this sudden, quiet departure. But again, Chandler just told himself that his parents would be fine. These were just a few random, weird things, but they didn't necessarily mean there was a problem. So Chandler managed to push his concerns out of his mind and went about his day. Since his parents were now going to be gone for the weekend, he promptly called his girlfriend, Catherine, and asked her to come over and stay with him for a couple of days. She came over, and because Chandler couldn't really do anything because of his injury, they basically spent the weekend lounging around, eating nice food, and watching Netflix. But by the end of the weekend, on Sunday morning, there was an unspoken feeling that something was wrong. Chandler had told Catherine about the strange circumstances of his parents' departure, but he had assured her, "I'm sure it's fine," and she had agreed, saying, of course, his parents were fine. But by Sunday, Bart and Krista still hadn't called or texted. They hadn't checked in with Chandler or Mitchell or anyone. They were just completely silent. And whenever Chandler or Catherine tried calling Bart or Krista's cell phones, the calls didn't even ring. They went straight to voicemail. But late that day, on Sunday, July 4th, just as real concern was starting to mount, a text message came through to Chandler's phone. It was from his mom, Krista. The message basically said, "Hey, we arrived in White Lake. You know, it's packed here, the service is terrible, but we're going to stick around for the parade, and we'll be back either Monday night or early Tuesday." As soon as Chandler and Catherine saw this text, it was like a huge weight was lifted. All their worries seemed to vanish, and they were just excited to see Bart and Krista when they came back the next day or the day after. But the next day, Monday, Bart and Krista did not come home. They didn't call anyone, they didn't text anyone. And again, whenever anyone tried calling their cell phones, which now included Mitchell, who had been looped into the situation, the calls went straight to voicemail. Then, the day after that, on Tuesday, July 6th, the day Krista had said they would be home by, they still didn't come home. And again, no one could get in touch with them, and they hadn't contacted anyone. Additionally, on that Tuesday, Krista's office began calling Chandler and Mitchell. They were asking if the boys knew where their mother was. Krista had recently taken a customer service job at an auto body shop, and apparently she was scheduled to work on that Tuesday. She was also scheduled to work the previous Friday, the day she and Bart had left for the lake. This meant she had left on this trip without telling anyone at work. According to her boss, Krista was the kind of person who would call or text ahead even if she was just running a couple of minutes late. For her to be a complete no-show without a word was totally out of character. But before Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine could even process this new worrying information, Bart's employer started calling them, asking the same questions. "Hey, do you know where Bart is? He's supposed to be working right now, and we can't get in touch with him." He didn't put in for any time off. So all afternoon on Tuesday the 6th, Chandler, Mitchell, Catherine, and other family members were frantically trying to call Bart and Krista. They were calling other people they knew in White Lake to see if anyone had seen them, but nobody had. And so finally, the next morning, on Wednesday, July 7th, when there was still no word from Bart and Krista, Chandler went to the police and filed a missing persons report. Almost immediately, the police in Windsor contacted the police up north in White Lake. They asked them to do a welfare check on the Halderson cabin to see if maybe Bart and Krista were there and just had terrible service, or if maybe there had been some kind of accident. But when the White Lake police arrived at the cabin, Bart and Krista were not there. No one was. In fact, the cabin looked like it hadn't been used in months. The outside was totally overgrown with weeds, and inside there was no food in the fridge. And most interestingly, the police told Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine that there was no damage to the cabin. There were no broken windows, no obvious signs of any storm damage at all. After this revelation, of course, the family's minds started racing. Wait a minute. Who called them and told them to go up there to fix broken windows that weren't even broken? Were those the same mystery friends who drove them up in the first place? What was going on? Was this some sort of trap? Had they been set up? Were they okay? By the following day, Thursday, July 8th, there was still no sign of Bart or Krista, and the police didn't have any new leads to speak of. Chandler was desperate. He went to the local media and pleaded with them. "Please run a story about my parents. Get the word out that they're missing. Maybe someone knows something and will come forward." And the local media did just that. While this media coverage was going on, Chandler went back to his home and, with his cane, hobbled door to door, asking each of his neighbors if they had a security camera on the front of their house. He was hoping a camera might have captured an angle of the street and might have seen his parents on the morning of July 2nd when they supposedly climbed into that mystery couple's car. Chandler hoped that if he could get that footage, someone might be able to identify who these mystery friends were. But unfortunately, none of his neighbors had the right footage. As it would turn out, though, it didn't matter. Because on that same day, the 8th, the police made a discovery. At first, it seemed relatively small, a minor detail. But when they examined it more closely, they realized it was a huge breakthrough, one that would completely break the case wide open. To understand this breakthrough, we have to go back to the 29th of June, 2021. This was 3 days before Bart and Krista supposedly hopped into that mystery car and headed up to White Lake. On that day, June 29th, Bart had finally had enough. There was something that had been bothering him for a very long time, and he had finally decided that today was the day he was going to get to the bottom of it. So Bart pulled out his phone, he punched in a number, and he put it to his ear. After a few rings, a young man named Omar Job answered the call. In total, Bart and Omar would speak on the phone for 17 minutes. For the first half of the call, it was basically just Bart being angry and aggressive towards Omar. But during the second half of the call, when Omar finally had a chance to speak, Bart's tone completely changed. He was no longer angry. He actually sounded totally defeated. After this 17-minute phone call finally came to an end, Bart was left in a state of shock. But he knew what he had to do next. He needed to set up an even more intense meeting with a group of people, and he needed to tell them what he had just learned from Omar. Within 24 hours, Bart had arranged this additional high-stakes meeting. It was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon on July 1st. July 1st was the day before Bart and Krista would supposedly leave for White Lake. And so on July 1st, the day of this pivotal meeting, Bart was working from home. At some point, he looked at his watch and saw it was just after 2 in the afternoon. Even though the meeting was still an hour away, the location was a bit of a drive, and he knew he needed to leave soon. So Bart stopped working, and he sent a text message to Chandler, who was in the house with him. The text just said, "Ready to leave when you are." Chandler was fully aware of how important this meeting was for his dad. He also understood the terrible position his dad was in. And so he had agreed to go with his dad to this meeting. After a couple of minutes, both Chandler and Bart had gotten dressed and were ready. They met downstairs on the first floor. After a quiet nod to each other, they began walking towards the front door. But then, something happened. Chandler was standing just behind Bart. As they moved towards the door, Chandler reached out and grabbed a rifle that he had hidden on the first floor. He raised it, and he fired at least 2 shots into his father's back. And then, once his father fell to the ground, either dead or dying, Chandler, as calm as can be, pulled out his own phone. He texted his mother and told her, "Hey, Dad's phone is dead, so just text me." Then, Chandler sent his mother another text, a chillingly normal one. "Get soda on your way home." His mother simply replied, "Kay, I can," smiley face. All Chandler was trying to do was buy himself as much time as possible to prepare the house for his mother's return. Over the next couple of hours, we don't know exactly what Chandler did, but it's assumed he moved his father's body into a hiding place. And then, after maybe trying to clean up a little bit, Chandler laid in wait for his mother. At 4:58 p.m., Krista clocked out of her job at the automotive shop. She made a quick stop at a store to buy Chandler some soda. And then, between 5:15 and 5:30, security cameras on neighbors' houses captured her car pulling into her driveway. A couple of minutes later, she walked inside of her beautiful little dream home, the home where she had raised her family for the past 2 decades, only to be immediately gunned down by her own son the second she walked through the door. It would turn out Chandler was living a complete double life. He had never graduated from college. He had attended college, but only for about a semester, and he had flunked out. But he just kept telling his friends and his family that he was progressing through his classes and that he had eventually graduated. It was all a lie. He also did not have a job at the insurance company. He just told his family that he worked from home, which really meant he sat in his room and played video games all day. He was not a rescue scuba diver for the Madison Police Department. For one, he wasn't a scuba diver. And 2, the Madison Police Department did not have a rescue scuba diving team. And, needless to say, he did not have a job with SpaceX. He had never even applied. As for his head injury, he may have bumped his head at some point, and he did go to the doctors by himself sometime in mid-June. But that doctor just told him he might have a mild concussion and offered him a neck brace, telling him he didn't even need to wear it unless he wanted to. But Chandler very quickly turned this non-injury into a debilitating, crippling, life-altering condition. He literally hobbled around everywhere with a neck brace and a cane, and the reason he did that was because he needed an excuse. He needed a reason for why he wasn't starting his non-existent job at SpaceX. In short, Chandler lied about virtually every aspect of his life to virtually everyone he knew. And for the most part, people believed him. However, his parents were becoming more and more suspicious, especially in 2021. He was telling them, "Oh yeah, I'm working at the insurance company," but he never had any money. He could barely pay them rent if he paid at all. And so his dad, Bart, would ask him, how is it that you're employed but you have no money? The way Chandler handled this was elaborate. He would create fake email accounts, pretending to be people in human resources at the insurance company. Then, acting as them, he would write these convoluted emails with ridiculous excuses for why Chandler hadn't been paid yet. He would have that fake email account email his real account. Then, from his actual email, Chandler would write back, acting angry and stern, saying, "You have to fix this. My family's not happy." Then he would once again pretend to be the HR person and reply, "I'm so sorry. It's some internal issue. We're going to fix it, but you just have to wait." Chandler would take these fake exchanges and forward them to his father. And while Bart didn't necessarily believe what he was seeing, it was enough to get him to stop asking questions, at least for a little while. But Bart and Krista were also suspicious of other parts of Chandler's life, like his school records. At some point, he needed to show them his transcripts. He would tell them, "Oh, I can't access my transcripts." And Bart and Krista were like, "Why can't you? Just log in and pull up your unofficial transcripts." The way Chandler handled this was the same way he handled the insurance company lie. He created fictitious email accounts of people who were supposedly college advisors at Madison College, where he claimed to have graduated from. He would conduct these phony back-and-forth email chains where it looked like the college was telling Chandler, "Sorry, you can't get your transcripts. It's this huge problem that's totally our fault, not yours. But you just have to wait. There's nothing we can do right now." When Chandler would forward these exchanges to Bart, Bart would get totally worked up about it. Finally, he demanded that Chandler give him a phone number so he could talk to one of these college advisors himself. So Chandler went out and bought a burner phone from a convenience store. He gave that phone number to his dad. And when his dad called the number, somebody picked up, introducing themselves as Daniel Spieth. But it was really just Chandler disguising his voice. And this Daniel Spieth gave Bart the same spiel about how sorry he was and how it was all the college's fault that they couldn't get his son's transcripts and he was just going to have to wait. And so finally, on the 29th of June, 2021, Barney'd had enough. He was convinced his son was lying. There was just too much about his son's life that didn't add up. So Bart decided he was just going to call Madison College himself, pretend to be Chandler, and see if he could get the transcripts. And so he dialed the number for customer service at Madison College. And after a few rings, Omar Job, a customer service representative, picked up. Initially, Bart was aggressive and mean towards Omar for no real reason other than his immense frustration with the whole situation. He's on the call pretending to be Chandler, and he's barking at Omar, "Give me my transcripts right now. I go to your school. There's no reason you can keep them from me." But after a couple of minutes, Omar was finally able to get a word in. He said, "Hey Chandler, I looked you up in the system, and you don't go to this school. You've never gone to this school except for maybe one semester, and you failed out." It's at this point, when Bart hears these words, that he just pauses for a really long time on the call. Then he begins asking follow-up questions that aren't really connected to getting transcripts anymore, because now he knows the transcripts don't exist. He begins asking Omar, "Does Daniel Spieth still work there?" Omar looks him up and says, "No, there's no Daniel Spieth that works here. And there's no Daniel Spieth that's ever worked here." Because Chandler had used 5 or 6 different fake names when pretending to be college advisors, Bart, in addition to asking about Daniel Spieth, asked about every other name he had interacted with. And one by one, Omar told him, "I'm sorry, those people do not work here. I've never heard of these people. They're not in our directory. I'm sorry." At the end of that 17-minute call, Bart knew. His son was living a monumental lie. So he hung up with Omar, and then Bart called the real college advisors at Madison College. He set a meeting for July 1st at 3 in the afternoon. And then he told Chandler that he had set this meeting and that Chandler was going to come with him, and together they were going to ask those advisors why they couldn't produce Chandler's transcripts. Bart, of course, knew Chandler didn't have transcripts. So he likely set this meeting up as an ultimatum, a way to force Chandler to finally call the meeting off and come clean about this huge lie so that Bart could help his son get back on the right track, stop lying, and start living a real life. But the way Chandler handled being caught was not to own up to any of it. He didn't call off the meeting. He just waited until the day of the meeting, and then he killed his father, killed his mother, and then dismembered their bodies. He burned their body parts in the family fireplace, including their heads. And when he couldn't completely destroy their bodies that way, he took what was left of their remains and scattered them all over town, in parks, in forests, in rivers. He even put his father's headless, armless, legless torso behind his girlfriend's parents' house. And all the while he's doing this, he's spinning this ridiculous story to his girlfriend, to his brother, to other members of the Halderson family, to the police, to his parents' colleagues. He tells them Bart and Krista just up and left on the morning of July 2nd with this mystery couple. And oh, by the way, my parents were packing cash and silver bars in their luggage. So, I don't know, they went up to White Lake and now they're gone. I don't know what happened to them. We don't know why Chandler chose this specific story. It's unclear if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were suspicious and had gotten into something that got them harmed or kidnapped, or if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were just gullible and had been taken advantage of. We don't know. He was just trying to make the whole situation seem plausibly suspicious. Ultimately, though, Chandler did so many things that got him caught. From the mountain of physical evidence he left behind inside of the house where he killed and dismembered his parents, and also at the various dump sites where he didn't even bother to bury the body parts. He would just put them underneath some sticks and branches, so they were very easy to find. To his extremely suspicious behavior on July 7th when he walked into the police station to report his parents missing. That whole time he was talking to police officers, he was acting so weird and saying things that just didn't make sense. He came off like a guy who did not care at all that his parents were gone and who was clearly hiding something. But the big breakthrough that happened on July 8th, the one that broke the case open, stemmed from that text message that Krista's phone sent to Chandler's phone on July 4th. When Chandler walked into the police station on July 7th and said his parents were missing, one of the first questions they had for him was, okay, well, when was the last time you spoke to your parents? Chandler told them he got a text message from his mother on Sunday, July 4th. He showed them the message. It said they had arrived in White Lake and they were going to be sticking around for the parade and they'd be back in a couple of days. But the police noticed a critical flaw. The text message had been sent on July 4th. But in White Lake that year, the big 4th of July parade was on July 3rd. So when this text came through, the parade that anyone in White Lake would have been aware of, it's a small place, you wouldn't miss it, had already happened. So why would Krista be texting her son that she was going to stick around for a parade that was already over? This led police to check phone records. And they would discover that, yes, that text message was sent from Krista's phone to Chandler's phone, but when it was sent on July 4th, Krista's phone was not in White Lake. Instead, it was inside the Halderson home right near Chandler's phone. When police went to the Halderson house, they searched it. They found Krista's phone in the garage, underneath a drawer, inside of a shoe, wrapped in tinfoil, right next to her driver's license. Chandler had obviously sent that text message himself using his mother's phone. But he had gotten the date of the parade wrong. This one discrepancy opened up the floodgate. Before long, it was beyond obvious that Chandler was the killer. And after a thorough investigation, it was determined that Chandler had acted entirely alone. His girlfriend, Catherine, and his brother Mitchell had nothing to do with it. They were just innocent bystanders caught in his web of deceit. Chandler would ultimately be found guilty of killing his parents. He would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, Chandler has still not taken any responsibility for what he's done. Instead, he just tells anyone who will listen that his plan is to continue to appeal his verdict, clinging to his lies until the very end. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In October of 2002, Mark and his wife Kathy were on their way to a very special event. It was their own baby shower, being held for them by Kathy's family all the way over in Baltimore, Maryland. For them, this was a 7-hour drive from their home in Ohio. Because of the long trip, Mark and Kathy really tried to get out the door as early as they possibly could. But, as it often happens, one thing led to another, and they ended up getting a pretty late start. By the time midnight rolled around, they were getting close. They were only about an hour away from their final destination. But at this point, after hours on the road, they both desperately needed a bathroom break. And so, they saw a sign for a rest stop and pulled off the highway. It was in a place called Frederick County, Maryland, which is about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. As they drove into the rest area parking lot, they noticed it was completely empty. It was late, dark, and quiet. Well, almost empty. There was one other car there. It was a dark blue, late-model 4-door sedan. It was parked head-in, right in front of the public restrooms. Mark and Kathy pulled their car into a spot that was just a few spaces over from this sedan. They got out, stretched their legs for a moment, and then walked up to the restroom building. Mark was done first, so he came back outside and stood by the women's restroom, just waiting for his wife to come out. As he waited, he turned around and faced the blue sedan. When they had first pulled into the lot, Mark had assumed the car was empty. It just seemed that way. But now, as he was looking at it from a different angle, he could clearly see there were 2 people inside. They were sitting in the front 2 seats. In the driver's seat was a middle-aged man. He was sitting behind the steering wheel, and he was looking directly at Mark. Just staring. And next to this guy, in the passenger seat, was a teenager who appeared to be fast asleep. And immediately, Mark felt this really deep, unsettling feeling. He was completely creeped out by these 2. Think about it. You're at a random, isolated rest stop in the middle of the night. It's totally deserted, except for you, your pregnant wife, and these 2 guys in a car. And one of them is just sitting there staring at you with this menacing look. And so, Mark is doing his best not to look intimidated. He's trying to stand his ground and not act fazed by what's happening. He's just a guy waiting for his wife. But in the back of his mind, he is just praying that Kathy comes out of that bathroom as soon as possible. He just wanted them to get the heck out of there and away from these 2 creepy guys. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the women's restroom opened and Kathy came out. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed her by the hand and, without giving her any explanation, he rushed them back to their car. They hopped in, he immediately locked the doors, turned the car on, and began backing out of the parking spot. And as he did, he glanced over at the blue sedan one last time. He saw the guy behind the steering wheel, the middle-aged one, was still looking over at him. He had that same intense, menacing look on his face. As they pulled away, Mark also noticed there was something odd about the sedan's trunk. There was a fist-sized hole right above the license plate, in the spot where you would normally put the key to open it. The entire scene was just totally bizarre. After Mark and Kathy sped out of the rest stop and were safely back on the highway, Mark finally explained to Kathy what had happened. He told her there were actually 2 people inside that sedan and that the driver was staring at him and they had just really creeped him out. That's why he had grabbed her and rushed them back into the car so quickly. She agreed that it sounded pretty creepy and they were both glad to be gone. But by the time the couple got to the baby shower in Baltimore, they had more or less completely forgotten about their strange experience at the rest stop. The baby shower went well, it was a happy occasion, and before long, Mark and Kathy were back home in Ohio getting ready for their new baby. About a week later, the couple was at home, just watching TV. Suddenly, a breaking news bulletin came across the screen. It showed a reporter who was standing at a very familiar location. It was the exact same rest stop that they had stopped at on their way to Baltimore, the one in Frederick County, Maryland. And right behind the reporter, cordoned off by police tape, was the very same late-model blue sedan they had seen parked there that night. The headline of this special news bulletin read, "DC Snipers Caught." It would turn out that the middle-aged man sitting in the driver's seat of that sedan, the one staring at Mark, was none other than John Allen Muhammad. And the person next to him, the teenager who had been sleeping, was Lee Boyd Malvo. These were the two men responsible for a highly coordinated 3-week-long attack that had terrorized the Washington, D.C. area and left 10 people dead. The fist-sized hole that Mark saw on the back of their trunk was what they used to shoot through. It was a sniper's port. It allowed them to stay completely concealed inside the trunk of the car while they were shooting their victims from a distance. The police revealed that Muhammad and Malvo had been using that particular rest stop in Frederick County as a place to lie low and hide out in between their killings. When Mark and Kathy had pulled in next to them that night, the snipers were only about halfway through their killing spree. Mark believes the only reason he and his pregnant wife were not targeted is because the killers were most likely trying to keep that specific rest stop off the police radar. It was their safe spot, their hiding place. And so they wouldn't have risked an attack right there because it would have brought law enforcement to the one place they felt secure. Although, ironically, that rest stop is exactly where they would ultimately be caught. In the end, John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection in 2009, and Lee Boyd Malvo is currently serving multiple life sentences. Back in 1988, a 35-year-old man named Ivan McGuire was an experienced skydiving instructor. He had over 700 successful jumps to his name, so he knew exactly what he was doing. On April 5th of that year, he was working in North Carolina, and he was tasked with a very specific job. He was going to be filming other instructors and their students as they jumped out of the plane. The way this worked was pretty straightforward. Ivan would go up in the plane with the instructor and their student. Ivan would then be the first one to leap out of the plane. As he fell, he would roll onto his back and point his camera upward back towards the plane. From this position, he could capture the perfect shot of the student and instructor jumping out. Ivan would then continue to film them as they all fell through the air right up until they pulled their parachutes. At that point, he would stop filming and pull his own. Now, this being 1988, the filming equipment that Ivan was using was much larger and more cumbersome than anything you would use today. He had a voice-activated camera attached to his helmet. From there, a long cord ran down to a big, heavy VHS deck that he kept inside of a backpack. It was an awkward setup, but he was used to it. So, despite the nuisance of the equipment, Ivan went up with the first student and instructor of the day. He jumped, he filmed, and he successfully recorded their jump. Everything went perfectly. When he got back on the ground, Ivan went over to the riggers, who were the people responsible for packing the parachutes. He gave them his rig so they could pack it for him for the next jump. Then, Ivan went over to a bench and began fiddling with his camera equipment. It was clear he was a bit frustrated with the way it was set up, and he was making all sorts of adjustments to the camera and the backpack. When it was time for Ivan's second jump of the day, with a new instructor and a new student, he was so preoccupied with fiddling with his camera that he almost made a huge mistake. He completely forgot to grab his parachute. He ran over to the plane and he was just about to get on when someone yelled out, "Hey, Ivan, you're not wearing a parachute!" He stopped, looked down, and said, "Oh my goodness, you're right!" He ran back over, grabbed his parachute rig, put it on, and then loaded back into the plane. He went up to altitude, he jumped out, he filmed the instructor and student, and it all went great. He made it safely to the ground, and his second jump was a success. And just like after the first jump of the day, Ivan took off his parachute, he gave it to the riggers to be repacked, and then he went and sat down on a bench and continued to fidget and fiddle around with his camera equipment. When it was time for Ivan's third and final jump of the day, with yet another new instructor and student, he seemed to have everything in order this time. He grabbed his parachute, put all of his gear on, ran over to the plane, hopped on board, and he took off. Once they got up to their jumping altitude, which was 10,500 feet, Ivan turned on his camera. The footage begins, and it shows the instructor and the student sitting across from him in the plane, getting their gear together. The jump master, who is towards the front of the plane, slides open the large side door. Ivan, who's going to be the first one out, makes his way to the edge. He turns himself upside down, so he's sitting with his back facing the open sky outside of the plane. He makes sure the instructor and student are right there, ready to jump out right after him. Once they're ready, Ivan lets go and falls out of the plane backwards, and he continues to film. On the tape, you can see the instructor and student jump out right afterwards, just as planned. Ivan continues to film them as they all go down. They're in free fall for a few seconds, and then you see the instructor and the student pull their parachutes. Their canopies open up, and they begin to float gently. At that exact moment, Ivan reaches back to pull his own ripcord, but he can't find it. For a few seconds, you see him start to flail. You can see his hands coming out in front of the camera as he's desperately trying to reach for his ripcord. And then, in that horrible moment, he realizes what's happened. That parachute rig he grabbed before he loaded up on the plane was not a parachute. In his haste and distraction, he had grabbed his heavy backpack, the one that had that big VHS deck in it. When he put it on, he had mistaken its weight and feel for his parachute. And so now, he's falling at terminal velocity over 120 miles per hour with absolutely no way to stop himself. He begins yelling. You can hear him scream, "Oh no! Oh God, no!" He keeps reaching back as if he's just going to magically find the cord, but there's nothing there. After a few agonizing seconds, you can see the ground getting closer and closer and closer. And then the footage cuts out. Ivan's body was later found about 1.5 miles outside of the designated drop zone, deep in the woods. His camera and the videotape were severely damaged from the impact, but investigators were able to splice the tape back together. And that's the only reason we know what happened in his final, tragic moments. An investigation into his death showed that the pilot had made the same mistake Ivan did. When the pilot saw Ivan get on the plane with that backpack on, he simply assumed it was a parachute. And so, ultimately, Ivan's death was ruled a terrible accident. As a fair warning, if you look into this case, you will almost certainly come across the actual footage of Ivan's final jump. In 1980, a young man named Bobby Shafran was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is about 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the general area, he didn't know a single person that was going to this particular school. And so, he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he hadn't been that popular in high school, and he always had a bit of a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars, carrying boxes and luggage up to their dorm rooms. He took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. It was a strange feeling. A couple of people even yelled out to him and said things like, "Hey, it's good to have you back here." One girl actually ran up to him, gave him a big kiss on the cheek, and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." Bobby was completely confused and said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." She just laughed and ran away. And so Bobby is totally bewildered by this. He doesn't know anybody here, but for some reason, everybody seems to know him. He walks up the steps, and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him and patting him on the back. Then, right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" By this point, Bobby knew whoever it was had to be yelling at him. This whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw at the other end of the hall another student who he didn't know, clearly waving at him and yelling, "Hey, Eddie, come here!" "What's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not. But I'm not Eddie." "Who's Eddie?" And the guy just said, "Yeah, okay, Eddie. It's good to have you back here, man," and then walked off. And so Bobby's just standing there thinking, what is going on here? So Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room. He goes inside and shuts the door. He's thinking, I just want to be left alone for a second, because this is just not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual. In just a couple of minutes, after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door. And Bobby's like, oh, great. Who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not? So he opens the door, and there's another student who he doesn't know standing there. And this guy, his face just drains of all color. He starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both just looking at each other like, what's going on here? And the student says to Bobby, were you adopted? And Bobby said, yeah. And then the student asked, is your birthday July 12th? And Bobby said, yeah. And so the student goes, okay, my name is Michael, and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin. At this point, to Bobby, this almost made a bizarre kind of sense. But it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin out there that he never knew about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie, because he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone he had talked to was so excited to see him. They all loved Eddie, and they thought Bobby was him, and they were psyched to have him back. After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie. They have to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie, and vice versa. And so, Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth. They hop inside, they're crammed in there together, and they dial up Eddie's number. As soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, hey, Eddie, my name's Bobby, and everybody here thinks I'm you. And then Eddie says, yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too. Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, it sounded just like his own voice coming through the phone. And so ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that he and Bobby could see if it really was true, if they really were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped into Bobby's car, and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. When they got there, it was the middle of the night. Eddie's house was the only house in this quiet suburb that had all the lights on. Michael and Bobby walked up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house, and right as Bobby was about to knock on the door, it flew open. And standing in front of Bobby was his exact clone. It was Eddie. And Eddie was looking back at Bobby, and he couldn't believe what he was looking at. They were definitely identical twins. They both immediately saw it. Michael would say that after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time they had this instant connection. They immediately knew they were related. They were laughing and they hugged and they just stared at each other. Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, Eddie would mimic it, and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after this, the story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York. They decided they would look into it to see if it was really true. One of the editors had a junior reporter go out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and confirm if they were, in fact, identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years just because of a chance encounter in college. And everybody who read it loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable. Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kellman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins, because these two twins looked exactly like David. Specifically, they said, you gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David. David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they too were enormous. And so David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie. And sure enough, He was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then, when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his. And they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so he's thinking, these are too many coincidences. They have to be my brothers. And so David called Eddie's home phone number. Eddie's mother picked up and she asked who was calling. And David said, "Hi, my name is David Kelman. I was born the 12th of July, 1961. And I'm looking at a newspaper article of two identical twins that look just like me. And one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing third twin." After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, "They're coming out of the woodwork!" So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house. And as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away. He was one of them. He was the third twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting each other, they were all wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen. That it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected. Shortly after David realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story, talking about how there were actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected. And once again, it was just this incredible Cinderella story. And now, this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper. They were on every talk show. And everybody had the same question. What similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school. We all smoked the same brand of cigarettes. We like the same food. We have the same taste in women. And on these talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the exact same mannerisms. On the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person, despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight. And all 3 of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together, they went out partying, they even met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so they weren't really asking too many questions about why they had been separated in the first place. But their parents were asking a lot of questions. Because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had 2 identical siblings, they had no idea. So the boy's adoptive parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was called Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York, very prestigious. Basically, the most powerful and wealthy people in New York used this adoption agency if they were going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them and asked for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids had been separated. The parents went to New York, they went into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they said, "Did you separate our sons at birth on purpose?" And one of the executives said, "Yes, we did." Because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point, David's adoptive father lashed out and said that was absolute BS. He said if they had told him his son had 2 identical siblings, he would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said that's the only reason it happened. And so, sorry, that's all we can tell you. The parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story. In fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But they couldn't get any more information, so they left the agency. But right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't disturb anyone, and he opened the door to the meeting room. He reached in to get his umbrella, and he looked inside. And he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne. They were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the distinct sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they had clearly just lied to the families of these three triplets, and they'd gotten away with it. So, between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something, and then Bobby's father discovering this champagne toast, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so, initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually, there's a conflict and we can't do it anymore. The parents believed this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this. That clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so, unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn. Over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much, because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. Over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. At some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. In the first year, it was extremely successful. It did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together, they had never really fought before, and so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business, and it got really bad really quick. They just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so, at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore, and apparently his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the three brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together, and now all of that was in jeopardy. And so Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks. And then, shortly after getting out of the hospital, he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the two surviving brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article. It was called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied. Although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research, in this article, Lawrence discovered that all the babies that had been used in the study came from the same adoption agency. The same one the triplets had come from, Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that, based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they'd been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health, and if that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered. And after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered each other. These two women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that the study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being. At this point, David and Bobby did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. And so they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that yes, this was part of a study. But they didn't get any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging. And they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was a doctor named Peter Neubauer, who was a very well-known psychologist in New York. Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, I won't answer any of your questions, and I won't give you any information about this study. And he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, He made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archives, so no one could access it until the year 2066. This has led many people to believe that the reason he set the date so far out was to guarantee that all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved. In the recent documentary called Three Identical Strangers, Dr. Neubauer's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Josefowicz, was interviewed. They asked her if she could shed any light on why this study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were. She said that she was not actually part of the study, she was just on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. She said the point of the study was to finally put to bed the age-old question of whether it was nature or nurture that made a person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that makes you who you are, or is it just your genetic makeup? Are you predestined to become a particular person, independent of how you were raised? And she said the results were incredible. That basically it has nothing to do with nurture. It's all about your genetic makeup. That we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household, where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family, with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants, English was a second language, and they owned a small shop. Natasha said this study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up, he had a different story. He visited under the false pretext that they were there as part of a routine follow-up for the adoption agency. He went on record and said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class. It was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child from the same agency. That first child effectively became the guinea pig, where scientists would come in and study the child, creating a baseline of how these parents parent. And then, once that baseline was established, the triplets were sent into their respective homes, with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up. The adoptive father was the key variable. Bobby's father, the doctor, was rarely around, but was devoted and loving. David's father, the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son unconditionally. But Eddie's father, the teacher, was very strict and rough with Eddie. He was quick to discipline him and rarely showed any affection. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was. That David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing, and Eddie did not. And so when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study, that we're all genetically predisposed. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third-hand information. But what we do know for sure is that these surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was ever done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University. When they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results. But it turned out to be over 10,000 pages of very technical information, and much of it was heavily redacted, so they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place or what it accomplished. It was all just very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980. The The same year, the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved, none of them were ever held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study. And so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions and not a lot of answers. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the 28th of January 1976, a man named Daniel Halseth was born in a small Oregon town called Estacada. It was a quiet place, about 30 miles southeast of Portland, and it was where Daniel learned his first lessons about life. His family owned a farm, and life on a farm means your day starts long before the sun comes up. From a very young age, Daniel was out there with his family, helping with the daily chores. This kind of childhood does something to a person. It instills a really strong work ethic, a sense of responsibility. But more than that, it taught Daniel the value of family. They all worked together, struggled together, and relied on each other to make ends meet every single day. When he got to high school, Daniel really started to come into his own. He had this incredible energy, a big, radiant smile that just naturally drew people to him. He was one of those people who seemed to be good at everything he tried, and he made it look completely effortless. During his high school years, he learned to play both the piano and the drums. His friends and classmates loved his passion for music so much that they gave him the nickname Drummer Dan. On top of that, he was a natural with computers and technology, something that was becoming more and more important in the world. And to top it all off, Daniel was handsome, athletic, and fit. He was the kind of person everyone looked up to, the guy that everybody wanted to be. But even with all of these good things going for him, life dealt Daniel a major blow in 1994. He was in his junior year of high school, a time when you're supposed to be thinking about the future, about prom, about graduation. But that year, his father, who he was incredibly close to, died unexpectedly from a brain aneurysm. For a young man who still leaned on his father for guidance and support, this was an absolutely crushing loss. The heartbreak was immense, but Daniel, just like the rest of his family, found a way to push through the pain and just keep going. A year later, in 1995, Daniel graduated from high school. He packed his things and headed to Salem, Oregon. He went to college there and earned his bachelor's degree in music, keeping that passion alive. But he was also practical. He stayed in Salem, went to another university, and earned his master's degree in business. It was during these years in Salem, while he was building his future, that Daniel met a young woman named Elizabeth Schwarek. She had grown up right there in Salem. And in many ways, she was a lot like Daniel. She was incredibly hardworking and seemed to excel at everything she put her mind to. She was also a model, and when she and Daniel started dating, they looked like something out of a movie, a perfect, beautiful Hollywood couple. In 2001, not long after Daniel had finished his master's degree, he and Elizabeth got married. 5 years went by, and their family grew. They became the proud parents of 3 young children, 2 girls and a boy. Their life seemed to be moving in a wonderful direction. Daniel, with his skill for computers, had founded his own IT company. The business was really starting to take off, and a lot of his clients were based in and around Las Vegas. So, the family made a big move to Nevada. They settled into their new life in Las Vegas, with Daniel's business thriving and providing for his family. But just a few years after they got settled, the focus of the family's ambition started to shift. It would be Elizabeth's career that took center stage. She had always been interested in politics, and in 2010, she decided she was going to run for a state Senate seat in Nevada. This was a huge undertaking. To win, she would need to campaign aggressively, which meant she would be gone from home a lot of the time. This put a huge responsibility on Daniel. He was already working full-time, running the company that paid all the bills. But now he would also have to become the primary parent for their 3 young children. When Elizabeth came to him and laid it all out, she said, "I really want to do this, but it requires a lot from you." "Are you willing to do this?" Daniel's response was immediate and full of support. He was actually excited for her. He had no problems with the arrangement whatsoever. And so, very soon, Elizabeth was out on the road, campaigning, meeting people, and trying to win that state Senate seat. Back at home, Daniel was juggling everything. He was the one goofing around with the kids, taking them hiking, pushing them on swings at the park. And then, after he tucked them into bed at night, his second workday would begin. He would stay up super late, running his computer business from their dining room table. All the hard work, all the sacrifice Daniel was making for his wife and her dream, it all paid off. Later that year, on November 2nd, Elizabeth won. She had run this incredible campaign that was built on a platform of family values, wholesomeness, and morality. Her victory shocked the state of Nevada. And what was even more impressive was that at just 27 years old, she became the youngest woman to ever be elected to the Nevada legislature. It was clear to everyone, both inside and outside of Nevada, that Elizabeth was a rising star. She was destined for greatness in the political world. And for anyone who knew the Halseth family, they knew that Daniel was her #1 cheerleader. He was so incredibly proud of everything she had accomplished. Their life looked perfect from the outside. But soon, that seemingly perfect life would start to crumble. It wasn't long after Elizabeth had won her election that Daniel began to notice a change in her. She was becoming suspiciously close with another man, a man named Tiger Helgelian. He was a former golf pro and, like Elizabeth, a fellow rising star in the political scene. Daniel noticed his wife was constantly texting with Tiger. It got to the point where Daniel actually reached out to Tiger directly. He begged him to stop messaging his wife, to just leave his family alone. But the texting, the calls, the interactions between Elizabeth and Tiger, they didn't stop. Then came the final blow. In October of 2011, less than a year into Elizabeth's first term as a state senator, Daniel found out that his wife and Tiger had been away together, alone, on a long, extended work trip. The realization hit him hard. It was almost certain that his wife was having an affair. When Elizabeth came home from this trip, she was in their bedroom unpacking. Daniel walked into the room and he confronted her. He accused her of being unfaithful. The argument that followed got very heated, but it never became physically violent. Daniel screamed and yelled at Elizabeth, swearing at her, losing his temper completely in a moment of pure betrayal and hurt. But at some point in the middle of it all, Elizabeth just said, "Daniel, stop," and he did. He stopped yelling, and he left the room. Over the next couple of days, it seemed like they were trying to fix things. Daniel and Elizabeth went to therapy sessions together at their church. It was a clear sign that they were both making an effort trying to salvage their marriage. But on October 21st, just 5 days after that big fight about the affair, Elizabeth went to the police. She claimed that during the argument, Daniel had touched her inappropriately. And so, to Daniel's complete shock, he was arrested. He was charged with something called open and gross lewdness, which is basically a charge for unwanted touching of another person. This particular charge is interesting. It's quite common in certain situations, like at a bar where people are drinking, but it's also known for being one of the more frequently falsely accused offenses. That's because the police don't require any physical proof to make an arrest. It essentially comes down to one person's word against another. Someone can, in theory, get another person arrested just by claiming they were touched inappropriately, even if there isn't a single shred of evidence to back it up. Daniel was found guilty. His sentence was 6 months of probation, and he had to attend anger management classes. But the most damaging part of the sentence was that he now had to register as a sex offender. Shortly after he was found guilty, Daniel filed for divorce. The divorce proceedings were brutal. They were centered on who would get custody of their 3 kids, and it was very bitter and very public. Because Elizabeth was a state senator, she was a public figure. And the foundation of her political career, the campaign she had run, was built entirely on this image of wholesomeness and strong family values. So, when the rumors started flying that she had an affair with Tiger Helgelien, that it had blown up her family, and that her husband was now charged with open and gross lewdness, it was a huge scandal. Despite her denying she ever had an affair and acting like she was the victim, the public pressure was too much. She was forced to resign from her state Senate seat in February of 2012. The divorce was finalized later that year. And because of Daniel's new status as a registered sex offender from that charge, he was denied custody of his 3 children. This was despite the fact that for the last several years, while Elizabeth was building her political career, he had been their everyday primary parent. So, Elizabeth got custody of all 3 kids. And what did she do? She promptly left Nevada, took the children, and moved to Alaska to live with Tiger Helgelien, the very man she had denied having an affair with. Shortly after she got to Alaska, she and Tiger got married. For Daniel, it was like his entire world had exploded in an instant. But the most devastating part of it all was that his kids, who he called his 3 little angels, were now so far away. He couldn't even see them if he wanted to. It was a heartbreaking situation. But just like he had done back in 1994 when his father passed away, Daniel somehow found a way to just keep going despite the horrible pain he was feeling. Over the next few years, Daniel poured all of his energy into his computer business. He made it his full-time focus, and it continued to grow. And he made every possible effort to see his children any chance he got. But his relationship with his ex-wife Elizabeth was not good, which made seeing his kids incredibly difficult. Eventually, Daniel met another woman named Bogdana. They got married, and for a while, it seemed to Daniel's family that he was finally starting to get his life back on track. Around this time, Daniel started sharing more of his life on his social media accounts. He made posts nearly every day, and they were always overwhelmingly positive and optimistic. His posts really showcased his wonderful personality. He was all about lifting people up, about being a good human being. And he posted tons of videos of himself just goofing around with his 3 kids. He adored them. They were by far the most important thing in the world to him. But despite this very cheerful outward appearance he projected on social media, privately, Daniel was dealt another very difficult blow. In 2019, his marriage to Bogdana, his second wife, fell apart. And so, once again, Daniel was all alone. His social media posts around the time of this second divorce, they remained positive and optimistic for the most part. But if you looked closely at any picture where Daniel was facing the camera, you could just see this distinct sadness in his eyes. But just as it seemed like Daniel's life was about to crumble again, something truly amazing happened. His first ex-wife, Elizabeth, and their 3 children decided to leave Alaska. They were coming back to Nevada to resettle in Las Vegas. This wasn't because Elizabeth wanted to get back together with Daniel. It was simply because she and the kids liked living in Las Vegas and wanted to return. As soon as they were back, Daniel suddenly got to see his kids all the time. He was so excited, so incredibly happy. In fact, by late 2020, his youngest daughter, Sierra, who was now 16, had basically just moved in with Daniel. Legally, she was not supposed to be doing that, and her mother, Elizabeth, was totally unhappy about it. But that was just how it was. Sierra was living with her dad. In August of that year, around the time Sierra had unofficially moved in, Daniel decided to take Elizabeth back to court. He wanted to see if he could get legal custody of Sierra. She was the only one of their 3 children who was still a minor, and at that point she was already living with him anyway. During the recorded video sessions for the custody hearing between Daniel, Elizabeth, and the judge, Daniel made his case. He told the judge that life in Elizabeth's home was totally toxic and not a good environment for his children, and certainly not for Sierra. He explained to the judge that Sierra was really struggling with some mental health issues. He said what she needed right now was professional therapy, something he had already enrolled her in since she had moved in with him. Daniel also presented a letter to the judge. He said Sierra had written it, and it basically backed up the idea that she was better off living with her father. Elizabeth's response to all of this was to say that Daniel was a liar, that he was not fit to be a parent. She claimed the letter he said Sierra wrote didn't sound like her, insinuating that he had forged it. The judge, who at times got very frustrated with both Daniel and Elizabeth, finally just laid it out for them. He said, "Look, you two have all sorts of issues between you, and it's creating a horrible environment for your kids. If you don't find a way to compromise, the people who are going to suffer are your children, specifically Sierra." Finally, in early 2021, Daniel and Elizabeth still had not come to any agreement, so the judge just made a ruling. He ordered Daniel to return Sierra to her mother's residence because, legally speaking, that's where she was supposed to be. Daniel begrudgingly followed the order. He took Sierra back to her mother's house and dropped her off. But later that same night, Sierra snuck out of her mother's house and just ran right back to be with her dad. And needless to say, Daniel was not unhappy about that. The custody battle over Sierra continued to rage for the next several months. All the while, Sierra chose to stay at her father's place, despite the court order and despite her mother pleading with her to come home. Then, in April of 2021, something very odd happened. On the morning of April 8th, several $100s was withdrawn from Daniel's bank account. The money was taken out from a few different ATMs around Las Vegas. This particular bank account was one that Daniel still shared with his second ex-wife, Bogdana. They just hadn't gotten around to separating it yet. These withdrawals were unusual for either Daniel or Bogdana, so the bank's system flagged them as potentially fraudulent. The bank sent out notifications to both Daniel and Bogdana, letting them know about the suspicious activity. Bogdana got the messages. She knew she hadn't taken out the money, so she tried to call Daniel to see what was going on. But Daniel didn't pick up his phone. So she sent him a text message, but again, there was just silence from Daniel. Thinking this was a little odd, Bogdana decided to reach out to Daniel's mother, Christine. She knew that Daniel and his mom spoke on the phone nearly every single day. She filled Christine in on the situation. After getting all the information from Bogdana, Christine also tried calling and texting her son, but she got nothing back. So, Christine's next step was to try and reach her granddaughter, Sierra. She called Sierra, but Sierra didn't pick up. She sent Sierra a text message asking to speak to Daniel. Sierra didn't get back to her right away, but eventually a text message came through. The response just said, "His phone has been acting up, but he's okay. It should be fixed by tomorrow night, no worries." Now, Christine felt a little bit of relief reading that her son and granddaughter were fine, but at the same time, something just felt off. It was strange that she couldn't get in touch with her son directly. And Sierra was acting a little bit cagey, not answering her phone, which was unlike her. The message itself just didn't quite sound like her. But for the moment, Christine let it go, figuring she would hear from her son within the next day or so. But the next day came, and by 10 in the morning, neither Christine nor Bogdana had heard from or seen Daniel. So Christine reached out to her granddaughter Sierra again. She called her, but once more the call went to voicemail. So she sent Sierra another text message. This time, she was more demanding. She wrote that she needed to speak to her father, and to please put him on the phone. But Sierra did not put her father on the phone. Instead, after a few minutes, Christine just got another text message. It said something like, "My dad's in the shower, so he can't talk right now." At this point, Christine's internal alarms were going off. She knew there was a real problem. She didn't know what it was, but something was wrong. Someone needed to go over to Daniel's house and make sure that he and Sierra were okay. So Christine contacted a woman named Peggy Newman. Peggy was Daniel's landlord, but she was also a close friend of his. Christine asked Peggy if she would mind going over to Daniel's house to do a welfare check. Peggy immediately said, of course, no problem, but told her she wouldn't be able to get over there for at least several hours. Christine said that was fine. But as soon as she hung up the phone, she was just consumed with anxiety. She couldn't stand waiting to find out what was going on with her son. So at 1:46 in the afternoon, with Peggy still out running errands, Christine just called the police herself and asked them to do a welfare check. But as it turned out, just a few minutes after Christine placed that 911 call, Peggy Newman and a friend of hers actually arrived at Daniel's house, getting there ahead of the police. When they got there, they hopped out of their car and walked up to the front door. As they were knocking, they looked over into the driveway and they noticed that Daniel's car, a blue Nissan Altima, was gone. They kept knocking, but the house was completely silent. Peggy reached down and tried the doorknob. She found that it was unlocked. She twisted the knob, opened the door, and she and her friend stepped inside. Just minutes later, Peggy and her friend came running back out of the house. Peggy pulled out her phone and called 911. The police still weren't there yet, and she frantically tried to describe to the dispatcher what she had just seen inside. 24 hours earlier, a young man and a young woman were spotted on surveillance cameras. They were seen withdrawing cash from several Las Vegas ATMs using Daniel's debit card. These were the withdrawals that had been flagged as fraudulent, the ones that had tipped Bogdana off that something was wrong. After making those withdrawals, the man and woman were seen again, this time on camera, at a Las Vegas supermarket called Winco. Inside, they purchased a few items, again using Daniel's debit card. Then they left, and they headed to a Las Vegas Home Depot. And once again, they were caught on camera purchasing a few more items with Daniel's card. After these purchases, the man and woman made their way to Daniel's house, where they would spend the night. The following morning, Daniel's blue Nissan Altima was spotted leaving Las Vegas at around 10:20 in the morning. That was about 3.5 hours before Peggy Newman and her friend went into Daniel's residence, turned around, and ran out to call 911. When police finally did arrive at Daniel's house on April 9th, they pulled up and saw Peggy and her friend on the sidewalk. Their faces were ashen and they were pacing back and forth. The police got out, talked to them briefly, and then went inside Daniel's house. And that's when they saw the horrible thing that Peggy and her friend had seen. But the police couldn't make sense of it. What they were looking at, it just didn't add up. Then, 4 days later, on April 13th, police in Salt Lake City, Utah, just happened to come across the man and the woman who were seen on camera on April 8th, the ones using Daniel's debit card at the Winco and the Home Depot. The police found these two people on a public bus in Salt Lake City. After going through the man and the woman's belongings, including their phones, the police discovered a video. It was a video these two had taken of themselves in the last couple of days, and it explained everything that was found inside of Daniel's house. The young man and the young woman you just saw, joking on camera about murdering someone, were 18-year-old Aaron Guerrero and his girlfriend, 16-year-old Sierra Halseth, Daniel's youngest daughter. Allegedly, on the morning of April 8th, after Aaron and Sierra had pulled all that money out of the ATMs, they drove to the Winco. There, they purchased disposable gloves, bleach, and drop cloths. Then, they had gone to the Home Depot, where they purchased a circular saw, saw blades, and lighter fluid. And then, they headed for Daniel's house. It hasn't been made public exactly what happened inside of Daniel's residence, but we can make a few logical assumptions. Daniel adored his children. That wasn't an act. He truly loved them with all his heart. It would never have crossed his mind that one of his own children or one of their significant others would ever want to hurt him. So, when Sierra and Aaron went inside Daniel's house that day, it would have been extremely easy for them to sneak up on him, to catch him completely off guard. He wasn't looking for a fight. He thought he was around people who loved and respected him because that's how he felt about them. But however the young couple did it, they would inflict up to 70 stab wounds on Daniel's body. Most of those wounds were in the back of his head. At some point during this vicious attack, they stuffed Daniel into a sleeping bag. And right there, in the middle of his own living room, they doused him in lighter fluid and set him on fire. It's unclear what exactly killed Daniel or for how long he was actually conscious and aware of what was happening to him before he died. But it's very possible that Daniel had at least a small moment in time where he recognized that his beloved little angel, Sierra, was actively trying to kill him. After Daniel was either dead or incapacitated, the young couple tossed their pocket knives into the kitchen sink. Then they retrieved their new circular saw, as well as a chainsaw, and they began attempting to dismember Daniel's body. But they were unable to do it. So they just set the saws down in the middle of Daniel's home, with bits of Daniel's flesh still stuck in the grooves of the blades. At that point, Aaron and Sierra attempted to destroy the evidence inside the house. They tried scrubbing everything down with bleach, but it was a totally ineffective cleanup. So then the couple decided they would just burn the entire house down. They figured that would destroy all the evidence. Around the time that Christine texted Sierra and demanded to speak to Daniel, and Sierra wrote back that he was in the shower, that was probably around the time that Sierra and Aaron were actively trying to set the house on fire. But the fire they set wasn't very big. It just kind of smoldered and then went out. So they just left. They left all of the evidence scattered all over Daniel's house. They left Daniel's destroyed and burned body propped up against the door that led into the garage. And they just walked out, hopped into Daniel's blue Nissan Altima, and at around 10:20 in the morning, they left Las Vegas. The only reason police were able to catch Aaron and Sierra in Salt Lake City a few days later was because of a simple mistake. The couple had made their way to Salt Lake City and got on a bus. But Aaron had not paid the fare. He had just snuck on. At some point, the transit authority came through the bus asking people to show their tickets. Aaron didn't have one. When they discovered this, they asked for his name. When they entered his name into their system, it popped up that the Las Vegas Police Department was actively searching for him. While only Sierra knows for sure why she turned on the one man who would have forever loved her and forever supported her, we do know a few things. Around the time that Daniel and Elizabeth were back in court, having those virtual meetings with the judge to decide on custody, Sierra had begun dating Aaron. She had fallen totally in love with him, and it seemed like he had fallen totally in love with her. Somehow, Daniel caught wind of the fact that Aaron and Sierra were secretly planning to run away together and go move to Los Angeles. When Daniel heard this, he told his ex-wife, Elizabeth. Then the two of them went and spoke to Aaron's parents, and they told them about the plan. Both sets of parents talked, and they all decided that it was in both of their children's best interests if they stopped seeing each other. So, starting in early 2021, the parents forbade their children from seeing each other, and that was supposed to be it. But even though all the parents were involved in this decision, because Sierra was living with Daniel at the time, it seemed that she focused all of her rage about this decision on him. He was the one who was there, enforcing the rule. And so, it's believed that in April of that year, Sierra decided she would just have to kill her father in order to get her boyfriend back. In Daniel's obituary, his family very conspicuously left Sierra out. It said that Daniel was survived by 2 loving children, not 3. His family has also come out and publicly stated that they hope Sierra and her boyfriend are given the harshest penalty allowable by law. Despite the existence of the confession video that Aaron and Sierra took of themselves, they have both pled not guilty and are currently awaiting trial. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Around 6:30 inches the evening on the 10th of December 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff was sitting inside a small guard shack at the Kenotok copper mine in northern Utah. He had a college textbook open in front of him, trying to study. The shack he was in was tiny, barely big enough for one person, with windows on all four sides. And when Brian looked out of those windows, all he saw was darkness. The sun had set a while ago, and this part of the mine was completely isolated. There were no streetlights, no other buildings nearby. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the fresh snow on the ground, which made everything outside look kind of eerie and desolate. Brian had been a security guard at this mine for just over a year, but he'd only been assigned to this specific guard shack for a couple of weeks. And in his opinion, it was the absolute worst post he could have possibly gotten. His job was to stand guard at a chain-link gate that blocked off a remote service road leading deep into the canyons. Because it was such an out-of-the-way entrance to the mine, almost no vehicles ever came through. So most of the time, the job was just incredibly boring. He would just sit there for hours watching the snowfall. But at the same time, it was also a very dangerous post. The Kennecott copper mine was famous. People called it the richest hole on Earth because of the massive amounts of copper, gold, and silver buried in the ground there. And all that valuable material made the mine a huge target for thieves. In just the last few months alone, over $150,000 worth of equipment and precious metals had been stolen. So Brian was always a little on edge out here, all by himself in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just the pitch blackness that got to him. It was also the fact that he was totally unarmed. The company didn't provide guards with any weapons. He didn't even have security cameras. If he ran into a group of thieves, his only defense was a telephone on his desk to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been completely normal. It was slow, quiet, and uneventful. So Brian decided to use the downtime to get some studying in. He was in nursing school, and his final exams were just a few days away. He was poring over his notes and textbooks, trying to cram as much information as he could into his head. While he was studying, he took out a thermos. His wife had packed him some soup for dinner. He unscrewed the lid, and just as he was about to take his first spoonful, the phone on his desk started ringing. Brian immediately hesitated. He knew there was a very good chance it was his wife Jennifer on the other end. But things at home right now were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had taken on this night shift at the mine to help pay the bills while he was in nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, money was incredibly tight. And to make things even more stressful, Jennifer was pregnant with their second child. The pressure of balancing school, work, and raising a family had been putting a huge strain on their marriage. About a month ago, Brian had hit a breaking point. He'd actually walked out on his family. He left a simple note for Jennifer, saying he just needed some time alone to think things over. Then he drove to the mine, turned in his security badge, and told his boss he was quitting. After that, he just left town. He spent almost a week in Las Vegas, and then he drove all the way out to San Francisco. He was trying to clear his head, but while he was out there, he got a call. His daughter, back home in Utah, was in the emergency room with a bad case of pneumonia. For Brian, that was the wake-up call he needed. He realized he couldn't live with himself if he actually abandoned his family for good. So he immediately got in his car and drove straight back to Utah to be with Jennifer and his daughter. His daughter, thankfully, made a full recovery. And Jennifer, despite him just up and leaving them, she agreed to take him back. But just because he was home didn't mean things went back to normal. There was this constant tension hanging over their relationship. Jennifer hadn't fully forgiven him for what he'd done, and Brian felt like he was walking on eggshells all the time. So now, sitting in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath before picking up the ringing phone. It was Jennifer. He chatted with her for a few minutes, trying to keep the conversation light. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something through the window. It was a flash of headlights, coming up the service road directly towards his guard shack. He told Jennifer he had to go, hung up the phone, and stepped outside to meet the vehicle that was pulling up. About an hour and a half later, around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, a supervisor named Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. He noticed the lights were on inside the shack, but he couldn't see anyone moving around in there. Todd thought this was pretty strange. Brian was under strict orders not to leave his post for any reason. That was the most important rule of the job. You stay put, no matter what. What made it even weirder was that Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. This post was so far away from anything else on the mine property, there was literally nowhere for Brian to go without his car, especially not in the freezing cold. So where was he? Todd was starting to feel a little uneasy. He parked his own vehicle, got out, and walked over to the shack. He opened the door and stepped inside. The tiny space was empty. Brian was gone. But on the desk, Todd saw Brian's hat and his half-eaten thermos of soup. It looked like he had just gotten up and walked away in the middle of his dinner. At this point, Todd knew something was wrong. He picked up the phone inside the shack and called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department to report a missing person. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig was driving down a dark, snowy desert road heading towards the Kennetock copper mine. Everyone in law enforcement knew this mine was a hotbed for theft. So, when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had vanished in the middle of his shift, Detective Lassig didn't waste any time. The first thought was that this could be related to thieves. Maybe they had kidnapped Brian, or worse. When Lassig pulled up to the main entrance of the mine, he saw another vehicle parked there. It flashed its headlights at him. A man in a security guard uniform rolled down his window and waved Lassig over. Lassig pulled up alongside him, and the man introduced himself as Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had made the call about the missing guard. Todd started his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so Lassig did. He followed Todd's taillights deeper into the darkness, down a winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennetock mine was huge, covering 3 square miles of rocky, mountainous terrain. They drove for a solid 10 minutes before Lassig finally saw a single light up ahead. It was the guard shack where Brian had been stationed. The two men parked their cars and got out. Todd pointed to the shack and told Detective Lassig that this was where Brian was supposed to be. Lassig pulled out a flashlight and aimed it at the ground around the shack, but there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any potential footprints or tire tracks were already covered up. So, Lassig stepped inside the shack. At first glance, everything looked normal. There was no blood, nothing was knocked over, no signs of any kind of struggle. But there on the desk was Brian's hat and that half-eaten thermos of soup. It was a strange little detail that just didn't feel right. Lassig was trying to process the scene, running through different theories in his head, looking for any clue about what might have happened. As he was thinking, the phone on the desk rang again. Detective Lassig just picked it up. He answered, and a woman on the other end sounded surprised. She said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to call her husband Brian. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department and that her husband had left his post sometime during the night and couldn't be found. He was literally in the middle of investigating his disappearance. He then asked Jennifer when she had last spoken to Brian. Jennifer, obviously shocked by the news, told him she had just talked to him a couple of hours ago. She said they were on the phone and then Brian suddenly had to hang up because he saw a car approaching the shack. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about the car or who might be driving it. But Jennifer said no. He just said a car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was a bit disappointed there wasn't more information, but he thanked Jennifer and promised to be in touch as soon as he knew anything. He hung up the phone and turned his attention back to the tiny room. But just a few seconds later, the phone rang again. Lassig picked it up. And again, a woman on the line said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer, and she was asking where he was. But as Lassig was listening, he realized something was very wrong. This woman's voice sounded nothing like the woman he had just spoken to a minute ago, who had also claimed to be Jennifer. And this second woman clearly had no idea about their previous conversation. He was talking to two different people, both of them claiming to be Brian Ruff's wife. Obviously, only one of them could be telling the truth, which meant one of these women had to be lying. A few days later, in mid-December of 1991, Detective Manny Lassig was sitting at the dining room table in the Ruffs' home. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and was sitting across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. Brian was still missing, and the investigation had been moving at a snail's pace. For the first few days, everyone was kind of hoping that Brian would just show up on his own, that maybe he had run off again like he had before. But as the days turned into a week, that seemed less and less likely. By now, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack that night. He quickly confirmed that one of the calls had come from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number. So, he was pretty sure he was now sitting with the real Jennifer Ruff. But he was still trying to figure out why another woman would call and impersonate her. And the timing of the calls was just too strange to be a coincidence. One right after the other. It was bizarre. So, as Lassig sat across from Jennifer, he started by asking her for her alibi. Where had she been on the night Brian disappeared? She told him she had been at the hospital all night, working a long shift. She even gave Lassig the names of several of her coworkers who could back up her story. Then, Lassig changed the subject completely. He looked her in the eye and asked her, point blank, if there was any chance her husband could have been having an affair. Were there other women in his life? Had he been acting strange or secretive lately? The reason he asked, of course, was because of that second mysterious phone call. He knew there was another woman out there, even if Jennifer didn't. When Jennifer heard the question, she looked down at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up at him and said, yes, she was suspicious of that. She told Lassig all about the problems they'd been having in their marriage. She told him how, just the month before, Brian had suddenly run off, saying he needed time alone. He was gone for a week with no contact, until he just showed up again, begging her to take him back. When Lassig heard that, he leaned back in his chair. He started to wonder if this whole investigation was a waste of time. If Brian had a history of just taking off without warning, what was to stop him from doing it again? Maybe this wasn't a crime at all. Maybe Brian would just turn up in a few days, just like last time. But Jennifer must have sensed what he was thinking, because she quickly added that the first time he left, he had at least left a note. And he'd told his boss he was quitting. There was some kind of warning. She insisted that it was not like Brian to just vanish in the middle of his shift like this, leaving his dinner half-eaten. He had his faults, she said, but this was different. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer if she knew where Brian had gone during that week he was away. In response, Jennifer got up and handed him a piece of mail from a nearby table. It was a credit card bill that had arrived that week, addressed to Brian. She explained she was confused when she saw it because, as far as she knew, Brian didn't even have a credit card. But apparently he did, and he had used it a lot while he was gone to pay for hotels, meals, and other things. Lassig took the bill and started looking it over. He saw a lot of charges from Las Vegas and San Francisco, and the amounts for restaurant meals and room service seemed a little high for just one person. He looked up from the bill at Jennifer, and he could tell from the look on her face that they had both come to the same conclusion. When Brian was away that week, he probably hadn't been alone. Jennifer then handed Lassig another piece of paper. It was their phone bill, with a detailed list of every call made and received over the past month. Jennifer said there were a bunch of numbers on the list that she didn't recognize. She thought maybe one of them belonged to the person Brian had been traveling with. As Lassig looked over the list of numbers, one of them immediately jumped out at him. It was the same number that the second woman, the fake Jennifer, had called from on the night Brian disappeared. Later that same day, Lassig was sitting in the living room of the house associated with that phone number. Across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kenotok mine, the same place Brian worked. Dale wasn't home at the moment, and Lassig wanted to talk to Christy alone before he got back. So, he didn't beat around the bush. He told Christy that he was almost certain she and Brian had been having an affair. Before she could even respond, he pulled out the credit card bill Jennifer had given him and showed her the evidence. For a second, Christy looked like she was going to deny it. But then her face crumbled and she broke down and admitted everything. She said she and Brian had been seeing each other for a while. She confirmed that they had run away together the month before for about a week. And even though they had both come back to their families, she said they were still very much in touch. She said that's why she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared. She was just calling to talk to him. But when a strange man's voice answered the phone, Detective Lassig, she said she panicked. On instinct, she just lied and pretended to be Jennifer, his wife, so that their affair wouldn't be discovered. But she was very clear about one thing. She hadn't heard from Brian since that night, and she had no idea what happened to him. Lassig sat back and just watched her for a moment. She seemed genuinely worried about Brian. And even though her call to the guard shack was incredibly suspicious, her explanation for it actually made a twisted kind of sense. Still, he wasn't about to rule her out as a suspect just yet. And now her husband Dale was also a primary suspect. If he had found out about his wife's affair with his friend and coworker, he would have a powerful motive for revenge. The next day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Dale Bradley was already sitting there, waiting for him. The moment Lassig came in, Dale asked if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And to Lassig, Dale's concern seemed real. He sat down and asked Dale how long he'd known Brian. Dale said they'd met about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they had become pretty good friends. They even hung out together outside of work sometimes. Then, trying to catch him off guard, Lassig abruptly changed the subject and asked Dale directly about his wife's affair with Brian. Dale looked completely stunned. He said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. Lassig explained what his wife had already confessed to. Dale seemed genuinely devastated. The idea that his wife was cheating on him, especially with a man he considered a close friend, was clearly a huge shock. As Dale was trying to process this, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. Dale, still reeling from the news, took a moment to compose himself. He said that on that night his car had actually gotten stuck in the snow. He was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, which was almost an hour's drive from the mine. He said he even had to call a friend to come and pull his car out of the snowbank, and then he gave Lassig the friend's name so he could verify the story. After writing down the name, Lassig told Dale he wanted him to take a polygraph test. He also said they would need to search his car. Dale agreed to both requests without any hesitation at all. A few weeks later, Lassig was walking across the parking lot at the Kennetock mine. Brian still hadn't been found, and the investigation felt like it was hitting one dead end after another. Dale Bradley and his wife Christy had both taken polygraph tests, and they had both passed. Lassig had also searched Dale's red Mustang, but he found no evidence inside that connected him to Brian's disappearance. On top of that, the friend Dale mentioned had confirmed his story. He said yes, he had gone to help Dale get his Mustang out of the snow that night. So, Dale's alibi seemed solid. At that point, both Dale and Christy were unofficially moved off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the possibility that Jennifer, Brian's actual wife, might have been involved. Her coworkers confirmed she was at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she had hired someone to harm Brian. She certainly had a motive. But with no evidence against her and still no body, all Lassig had was a gut feeling, and that wasn't enough. But then, just a few days ago, Lassig got a new lead that sent the investigation in a completely new direction. That's why he was back at the Kennetock mine to talk to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, again. Lassig went into the office building and found Todd's office. When Todd saw him, he jumped up from his desk and eagerly greeted him, saying he would do anything he could to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told him to sit back down. Then, Lassig sat down, pulled out a tape recorder, and hit the record button. He then told Todd why he was really there. Two of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metals and equipment from the mine and selling it all at local pawn shops. An internal investigation had uncovered a whole ring of employees who were involved in the thefts. Todd started to look nervous. He shifted in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he had nothing to do with it. He said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he knew that, and that wasn't why he was there. He explained that when he reviewed the records from the theft investigation, he discovered that Brian had been the one who had reported some of his coworkers for stealing. So now, Lassig had a new theory. What if, on the night he disappeared, Brian had stopped a coworker's car, found stolen materials inside, and they had killed him to silence him? Todd leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful for a moment. Then he admitted that, yeah, that was possible. He then started telling Detective Lassig about several places on the mine's property where a body could be hidden. As an example, he suggested the giant gravel pile by the concentrator, a machine that crushes minerals and grinds them into dust. Todd explained that if Brian's body had been placed there, it would have been sucked into the grinders and pulverized along with the rocks. He would be completely gone. Detective Lassig was taken aback by how specific Todd was being. It was like he had already thought about this in great detail. Sensing something was off, Lassig just let Todd keep talking. And Todd did. He kept offering up one gruesome theory after another about what could have happened to Brian. At one point, he suggested Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles, where weeks' worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen on top of him, burying him completely. He said if that happened, Brian would be under several tons of rock by now, and the police would never, ever find him. On the 10th of July, 1993, a full year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig was driving through a barren stretch of desert in Utah, about 50 miles south of the Kennetock mine. There had been absolutely no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours searching the mine with police dogs and helicopters looking for any sign of Brian. But they had found nothing. Not a single trace. By this point, Lassig was sure that foul play was involved. But it was impossible to prove a murder without a body and without any evidence tying his suspects to the crime. For months, his team had investigated every single security guard at the mine, especially the ones involved in the theft ring. But they had verified that every guard who was on duty that night was at their assigned post when Brian vanished. And they had checked the alibis of everyone who wasn't scheduled to work. They couldn't link a single one of them to Brian's disappearance. That included his supervisor, Todd Fallows, who, despite his strangely specific theories, was eventually linked to the theft ring, but had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and her husband Dale, they had been ruled out early on. Their alibis checked out, they passed lie detector tests, and nothing new had come up in the last year and a half to make them suspects again. And Brian's wife, Jennifer, also remained off the list. She had a strong motive, but her alibi of being at work was airtight, and they could find no connection between her and any possible accomplice. So after more than a year of dead ends, the case had gone completely cold. But that morning, the investigation had suddenly come back to life. A group of campers had called the sheriff's department to report finding skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew it was a long shot, but he was hoping it might be Brian. When he arrived at the location the campers had described, he got out of his car and walked across the dry, cracked earth to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow, makeshift grave. The skeleton was still wearing clothes, a dust-covered dark blue jacket. Lassig crouched down to get a better look, and he saw that it was a security guard's uniform. He put on a pair of gloves and carefully searched the pockets of the jacket. His fingers closed around a wallet. He pulled it out, opened it, and found an ID card and credit cards, all with the name Brian Ruff. It seemed clear that this was Brian's body. But because it was so decomposed, they would need to check dental records to be 100% sure, and that would take some time. While the crime scene techs carefully removed the remains, Lassig stayed behind with a K9 unit to search the area for any other evidence. And sure enough, just a few feet away from the grave, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells scattered in the dirt. It looked like Brian had been shot 5 times and then buried. Then, a few yards away from the shells, a police dog started barking. An officer called Lassig over. The officer was holding up a black work boot. There was a clear bullet hole right through the leather. Lassig was sure the boot had to be Brian's. But aside from the body and the boot, 18 months of brutal desert weather, scorching heat, wind, sand, snow, and rain had erased almost every other trace of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig now knew where and how Brian had been killed, he was worried he was no closer to figuring out who had done it. 12 years passed. On the 30th of April, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office received a phone call. Park had been assigned to the cold case unit at the beginning of the year, and his full-time job was to solve old, forgotten crimes. The detective on the phone was from the sheriff's department in the next county over. He was investigating a recent homicide, and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases. Specifically, the murder of Brian Ruff. After the call, Park hung up the phone and went straight to his filing cabinet. He dug through the old dusty files until he found the one for Brian Ruff. He sat down at his desk and began sorting through the stacks of decade-old papers. And as he read, he noticed a tiny piece of evidence that the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized this small detail was the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on all the forensic evidence, this is what police now believe happened to Brian Ruff on the night of the 10th of December, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down that dark, winding service road toward the isolated part of the Kennetock mine. Up ahead, they saw the single light from Brian's small guard shack. The killer pulled their car right up to the shack and parked. When they got out, Brian came out of the shack to see who it was. He waved hello. The killer waved back and walked towards Brian. And as soon as they were close enough, they grabbed Brian, spun him around, and tied his hands behind his back. Before Brian could even react, the killer forced him into the back of their vehicle. The killer then got into the driver's seat, made a U-turn, and sped away from the mine, heading out towards the desert. As they drove, Brian was screaming and kicking in the back, trying desperately to escape. But the killer remained calm and just kept driving for nearly an hour until they reached another remote spot deep in the desert, about 50 miles away from the mine. They pulled off the road and stopped in an open, snow-covered patch of land. The killer got out, opened the back door, and dragged Brian out of the car. Brian was still fighting, but he was exhausted. He started pleading for his life, promising that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone what had happened. But the killer wasn't listening. They grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then, at gunpoint, forced him to dig his own grave in the frozen ground. When Brian was finished, the killer raised the shotgun and shot him 5 times. After Brian was dead, they pushed his body into the hole he had just dug. The killer then got back into their car, a red Mustang. But when they tried to drive away, the Mustang's tires spun in the snow. They were stuck. So, they had to make a phone call to a friend for help. The friend came out, having no idea that a murder had just been committed only a few feet away, and helped the killer get their car out of the snow. And then, the killer drove off into the night. The killer was Dale Bradley, the coworker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that his car had gotten stuck in the snow an hour away from the mine was true. But it wasn't an alibi. It was a confession. He was describing being stuck at the crime scene. The friend who came to help him was telling the truth when he confirmed the story to the police, but he had no idea he was helping a murderer flee the scene of the crime. The police never cross-referenced the location where Dale said he was stuck with the location where Brian's body was eventually found. And so, they mistakenly believed his story. Additionally, Dale had passed a polygraph test early in the investigation, which made him seem even less like a suspect. He and Christy eventually divorced, likely because of the affair, and Dale later remarried. But in 2005, when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered, the detective investigating her case noticed that Dale Bradley had now been close to 2 different people who had been murdered. He thought it was too much of a coincidence, so he called Detective Park, the cold case investigator. That phone call prompted Detective Park to take a fresh look at the entire Brian Ruff case file. And that's when he found the note about the tiny speck of red paint found on the sole of the black work boot that was discovered near Brian's body. Park had the paint speck reanalyzed, and he was able to match it perfectly to the paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale Bradley's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was arrested and charged with Brian Ruff's murder on the 19th of September 2005. In 2007, he accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to the lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for his second wife, Crystal, her murder case remains unsolved to this day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.